Hello, host Larry, and today I'm joined by two friends that I've had on previously, Mike Buhl and Dennis Murphy. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
So let's get right into it. We had a very exciting election, obviously last Tuesday, and we have a new president-elect, which is Joseph Biden, and then we have a vice president-elect, Kamala Harris. Um, so I guess I will ask each of you about your impression about the election, what it means, for the country, what does it mean for yourself, So maybe does anybody
Dennis,
go first, Mike or Dennis? Maybe Mike go first.
you would like me to go first? Yeah, I live in Texas, so it was an upset for Democrats here. There was high hopes that Texas would turn blue. That did not happen, and in fact, in some of the counties, there's entrenched, voters that voted for Trump, and only the metropolitan areas. And I double checked the statistics. Dallas County, Austin, Houston, and El Paso voted for Democrat Biden. So my, view of the election results is the more things change, the more they stay the same. I think, yeah, it's good that Biden won, obviously, but there still seems to be a deep entrenchment. It still seems like we're very polarized, and you can see it in the way people are voting. Metropolitan areas still seem to go for Democrats, rural areas go for Republicans, and that has not changed. Even when I looked at the results in Texas, it has not changed. So that's worrisome. So I'm somewhat optimistic. I'm optimistic that there's going to be fruitful change. Maybe now we go from far right to center left a little bit, but I suspect the Biden administration will probably go more in the center. I get this feeling that he's going to go in the center, maybe try a third way or something. But so I'm optimistic, but then I'm also worried that there's just going to be this entrenchment. And then you got the midterm elections coming up. So I'm more that. So I'm cautious. When I see the results the way they are, in some cases, there was change in some states. Like Pennsylvania, right? Now Georgia, right? Nevada, I guess, or Arizona, but all the other states, it seems like the more things change, the more they stay the same. It's not really that much flipping. I could be mistaken. So I'm going to let y'all go next. So my impression is with Texas, I didn't see that much change. People
Uh,
were optimistic. People were very optimistic. Like even Democrats in this state, and it didn't produce that result. And the counties seem to still be predominantly divided. If you're rural, you voted Republican. If you're in a metropolitan area, you voted Democrat. So I didn't see any flipping. I didn't. And I checked the map. It was overwhelming in some areas. It was still very entrenched. So that's my analysis. But I'm only speaking of Texas. I don't know. I saw some of the other results that all of you have, available. It seemed the same with Florida. You know, I didn't see any, no flipping, right? Didn't flip, right? But
well,
Northeast is solid blue, right?
I,
Northeast.
I think it's important to drill in each state, and I
Yeah.
think the New York Times does a good interactive graph. So if you zoom into Florida, you will see that South Florida, which is very population heavy, Miami-Dade, Broward County, and Palm Beach, they were moving in a direction of Republican and towards Trump. And if you do like an ethnic breakdown, it was Cuban majority neighborhoods that tilted to Republican, which suggests that um, some of the red campaigns, accusing of Biden of being a socialist, of certainly being too friendly to Cuba, because the Obama-Biden administration normalized relations with between U.S. and Cuba. That certainly had an impact. If you zoom into Texas, the southern Texas region, or like Brownsville, um, there was a tilt towards Republican. Um, but then the Republican margin decreased from 9 percentage points to 6 percentage points, which means that the Republican turn in the Hispanic counties was more than offset by the growth in the Democratic margin in the big cities, like Austin, Dallas, etc.
El Paso.
El Paso, yeah. So these are very interesting trends. Also, another thing I found interesting, I looked at migration data in Arizona, which shows that in the second decade of the century, so from 2010 onwards, we had 500,000 Californians who relocated to Arizona. And then the swing in the other direction is 300,000 Arizonans who moved to California, right? So that means there's a 200,000 net gain of Californians, residents in the state of Arizona. And as you can see, I mean, the decisive county, it's called Maricopa, which is where the city of Phoenix is located. That there definitely was a swing to its Democratic, right? And then the story in Georgia also very interesting because you have, African American regions. I mean, in the Southwest, but then also in the North and around Atlanta. Uh, where the population overall is growing, and that will produce a swing to its Democratic, which is the reason why Georgia, for instance, is no longer a red state. I mean, it's basically a purple to bluish state at the moment, and we have to see what the Senate elections in January will produce, because there's 2 Senate seats open. Yeah, and then what swung the election is, of course, the North, right? So you have Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, where at the beginning, I remember in the first night of election night, all of these states were Republican because the in-person ballots get counted first before the mail ballots. Trump denounced the mail ballots as being fraud, so to speak, which is the reason why his voters mistrusted the mail ballots. And it produced the mistaken impression, it turns out. I mean, I remember it was like a 700,000 margin on election night in Pennsylvania, in favor of Trump. But of course, that got reversed. I think now it's like 45,000 win for Biden. So, and where did the turnout increase? Well, as you would expect, as Mike mentioned, I mean, the big cities, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, the southeastern counties of Michigan, so like the Detroit area, Wayne County, and also interestingly, then some of the northern counties along the Great Lake did a tilt towards towards Biden, and I think it has to do with the fact that there's a disappointment with the president. Of course, the poor handling of COVID, I think, was a big thing. Also, the fact that he won these states on the promise of restoring manufacturing jobs, and those are down, I think, for 2 reasons. I mean, firstly, I think the tariff war was ultimately, self-destruct mission. And also, the pandemic destroyed a lot of opportunities. Um, so I guess he deserved a defeat, right? But okay, now we'll get to Dennis' analysis. So
Dennis, your turn.
I think you might be muted at this point, but yeah.
It's okay. So I feel like we probably almost certainly did not win in the way that we needed to in order to restore a return to normal politics. So when I take a look at this, we had the highest voter turnout rate in over 100 years, percentage-wise. Absolute vote-wise, Joe Biden received the most votes of any presidential candidate in U.S. history. And who received the second most votes? It was Donald Trump. He received more votes than Barack Obama did when he was running for his first term. So I don't know how to really contextualize what has happened. The Republicans made gains in the House of Representatives. The Senate may very well stay Republican control. And we had the highest voter turnout rate in our lifetimes, likely to remain so. How many things went wrong with the Trump administration? I mean, you could take your pick. How many things didn't we approve of or like or would even consider remotely sound? Innumerable. What was the breaking point for a lot of people? I don't know. But what is clear is that whatever that breaking point was, it wasn't something shared by a very large number of American people. So we're left to deal with something rather troubling. In a way, I understand how counties are becoming more important, and you're seeing shifts at some levels, particularly with increased voter turnout in cities, and cities increasingly turning blue. But I can't help but feel as though that we have, in at least one important way, solidified this as politics is normal moving forward, at least for the foreseeable. Donald Trump has not yet conceded the race because it wasn't a big enough win against him. Whatever swing happened in Arizona, it's still difficult for me to say whether or not that also has something to do with John McCain, because John McCain was a very popular senator in his home state. Well, yeah, in his home state, in Arizona, and Donald Trump
Just to
opposed him.
clarify, his widow was, I guess, Cindy McCain, right? She endorsed Biden, so that's an important piece.
Yeah, a very large number of highly prominent Republican people voted for Biden. Biden had a Republicans for Biden party. And a lot of the areas where you see a swing towards purple is actually areas where you'd find a lot of the people who are associated with the deal-making process of being a Republican switching. So, for instance, inside of Virginia, that's where most of the never-Trumpers actually are. And that's been swinging further and further to blue, at least in Trump's presidency. So I'm unsure whether or not this is something temporary, i.e. a rejection of Trump from the class of old school Republicans causing a temporary shift. I'm also unclear the degree to which Trump is actually gone. Not that I don't think that he will leave in January, but I'm concerned about 2024. I'm concerned about the idea that Donald Trump or a Trump-endorsed candidate will go out and say that 2020 was stolen from them. Therefore, they need to rile up popular discontent to the point where it will take them back to the White House. And I can certainly see them taking maybe not the House, but a stronger lead inside of the Senate in 2022. I don't feel comfortable with this situation. And earlier there was an offhand comment about how Trump doesn't trust mail-in ballots. That's why his voters don't trust mail-in ballots. But people have been talking about distrusting mail-in ballots prior to Trump. A lot of what Trump has done is he's tapped into a sense of paranoia and a sense of democracy not being played fair with the Democrats to move this forward. For instance, the Tea Party was very big on voter ID laws, was very big on making sure that ballots were verified in many different ways. So Trump is making a problem worse, but that popular discontent was already there. And a lot of people, I don't think this is where my cynicism is starting to come in, and this is where my concern is. I don't actually think that the Republicans or Donald Trump are in any position to say that the mail-in ballots were fair, because I don't actually think that the people that vote for them would be able to tolerate the idea that the mail-in ballots were done fairly. And what I mean by that is, Lindsey Graham recently said that if Trump conceded the race, they might never be able to put a Republican in the White House again. And Mitch McConnell and a couple of Senate Republicans have, at the very least, made movements towards standing by Trump in this idea of counting every ballot. And I'm concerned that we do have a return to normalcy being proclaimed by a coalition of the reasonable. But this coalition of the reasonable isn't actually tapping into or including a population that thinks that the coalition of the reasonable is actually a form of conspiracy. And I'm concerned about how this will go. And I don't feel comfortable with the margins of victory. Yeah. And I certainly don't feel comfortable with the idea that cities are going more blue, so states are going to turn purple. The only thing I see there is a growing hatred of cities. And I'm concerned, not so much for this election, because I don't actually think there'll be much violence this time around. I'm concerned about incremental precedents that will lead us to a very dark place for the next election cycle.
Dennis, you mind if I ask you a follow-up question?
Sure.
You made very fine points. I wrote this down while you were talking. What effect do you think the Trump effect will have on the future of American democracy? The Trump effect itself. I mean, the next 10 years, you think the Trump effect, there will be surrogates, there will be people that will imitate Trump, or populism is fair game, and it will permanently scar the American political system, or maybe even some Democrats will try it out. I don't know, But my question is, what effect do you think the Trump effect will have on the future of American political system, especially the two-party system?
So I'm pretty much convinced that the populism approach is going to stay, in large part because Trump wasn't exactly the most original figure. What he did was he proclaimed things that were most popular to key demographics that were supporting him. So he was a hodgepodge of different ideas, so paleo-conservative, Tea Party goers, old school foreign policy hawks, they all melded together in this uneasy mixture. But this uneasy mixture is having a legacy in that people don't actually take this as a Frankenstein's monster anymore. They take it as something that they can follow as a template. Mm-hmm. And I can't help but remember Senator Cotton. He won re-election. I'm pretty sure he did. I think he was running and then got it. But he's still in the Senate, let's put it that way. And he made movements in support of Donald Trump's idea of employing a more military solution to rioting. And he was his policy position wasn't so outside of the ordinary that it received repudiation. In fact, I know plenty of Trump supporters that love him. And I don't know why, and I'm not even entirely sure that they know why. And I can't help but feel like the infrastructure put in place by a Trump-like presidency, by the Tea Party before him, is permanently entrenched inside of our system. And I think one of the ways that you can see this most clearly is with a shift that's been going on right now between Fox News and Newsmax. Fox News, with Chris Wallace and a whole bunch of people, it has been very pro-Trump, but it hasn't been entirely sycophantic, particularly in the last year. And one of the things that we've seen is that there's been a rebellion amongst a lot of people watching Fox News to go towards less critical, more populist forms of news entertainment. And a lot of this transition is being seen to Newsmax, to platforms like Breitbart and the Daily Caller.
OAN, I think.
Yeah,
Oh,
that
yeah,
is
Like that. Yeah.
the One America News Network.
One America.
Yeah, that's still going very popular, and I'm seeing this transition in such a way that as Fox News maybe moderates itself, maybe tries to distance itself from what it seems as a disaster, as a generational change is going on with inside of the leadership of Fox News itself, because Murdoch is giving over some control or authority to his sons, there's been a shift. So we don't actually have any form of uniform media landscape or uniform reality anymore. So the infrastructure that was put in place to allow a substantial number of people inside of the United States continue to vote for Trump no matter what happened, because they were convinced that not voting for him would result in something much worse for them personally, whether it be communism or some other form of moderate neurosis. No, I'll take that back. That's too harsh. But some form of radical acceptance of something that shouldn't be normalized in response primarily to the perception that the other side, if they win, will either be very corrupt, will sell out the country, will engage in a form of suppression or oppression of the Republicans, or religious liberties, or gun rights, or any number of things, including the idea, rather foolishly, that people have that Joe Biden, maybe he's not crazy, maybe he's okay, but he's going to die because he's senile and demented, and in a year we'll have President Kamala Harris, and then we can shift all of the negative feelings we have, if not towards Biden, then to Harris. It doesn't really matter that Biden and Trump are only a few years apart in age. So I don't think that we will see the genie put back into the bottle. And in large part, I can't help but wonder if the structures that we currently have in place will solidify that. Because when you take a look at a lot of people talking right now from different forms of anchors or different forms of pundits, there seems to be an acidic hatred or a generalizing demonization of the Trump voter. References to them as cultists, references to them as white supremacists, as uneducated, and proto-fascistic. Those people will never read or watch a news publication with people telling that about themselves. If I go out and say, hey, Mike, you're a white supremacist, everything you do is disgusting. You are supporting the idea that children should be put into cages. You are encountering or creating this idea of a police state emerging. At what point do you say, you're right, I never knew that, I really shouldn't vote for Trump? Because at a certain point, you just stop watching and you go about your life. And when you're no longer attached to the moorings of ordinary gatekeeped information and ordinary reality, then what is the Daily Caller? What is Breitbart? And then you might even go further, because it gets much worse than Ben Shapiro. Ben Shapiro is, if anything, milquetoast for some of the more conspiracy black-pilled people out on the internet. And I can't help but feel as though we didn't score a victory in a war sense. I think what we have is a tactical breather to try to make progress. And I think that we need to make concrete steps in order to ensure that what we have doesn't get worse. And I don't quite know how to solve that. And I am uncomfortable with the idea that we should assign power either to a government or to a big technology firm to moderate the beliefs of the people of a country. So, how do we go about this? I don't understand it. I wish I did. I wish I did. And who knows? Maybe we will have Trump 2.0. Maybe we'll have Trump 3.0. Maybe we'll have Trump version 1000 in just a few years. And I don't get it.
I mean, one qualification I would like to make about, white supremacy under Trump. I mean, so it's certainly true that, he didn't fully distance himself from those groups. But, if you look at the exit polls that were done, you will see that it is the, white people without a college degree which swung towards Biden, right? And then if you look at the other groups, so African American, Latino, and Asian, there was still a huge Democratic margin, but that Democratic margin is smaller than it was 4 years ago, right? Which suggests that, again, I mentioned the South Florida, South Texas phenomenon among the Hispanic voters. But I'm sure, among other demographic groups, you'll find that too. So I would say it's from a, political sociology standpoint, it would be very difficult to attribute the Trump increase of the base based on, a narrative of white supremacy. I mean, it's very decisive that, I mean, if you recall that, Biden wasn't campaigning that much because of the pandemic, but the strategic locations that he sought to visit, I mean, like, Scranton, PA, or whatever, where he says, I'm a working class kid, Irish Catholic, and I still have the same mores as you do, and you guys should vote for me, right? So I mean, it was a clear indication for to appeal to the white Midwest voters, and I mean he clearly didn't peel off the whole Trump base because Trump still has a leading margin on whites without college, but it is certainly smaller than it was 4 years ago, where there was very clear visceral hatred against Hillary Clinton. And then, so another point in political sociology is that, as Dennis mentions, I think the rural versus urban divide. I think it is the biggest, I think, divide. Also, education levels. So it's education levels and urban versus rural, and I think what that means practically for Democrats or for progressives who if there was like another populist rising up inside of the GOP, I think that would also be an interesting possibility in American politics. Anybody who tries to find a way to resolve the you could say hatred in the country would have to find a way to mitigate those you could say, I guess, left behind. There was the title of a book by my department professor Robert Woodnow. It was published 2 years ago, and he interviewed farmers and rural residents in Kansas, and his interviewees were basically telling him about the rage that rural voters are feeling against the system. I mean, against a government where they didn't perceive that there was a direct benefit for them. Because I mean, it is true that like in a lot of cases, I mean, a lot of investments, tend to happen in urban areas where there's economic development, there's spillover effects, economies of scale. I mean, there's different kinds of technical economic reasons why a lot of government investments are happening in cities. And then it's like, okay, well, the rural voters say, okay, well, the government is so far out there in Washington D.C. The lobbyists are they don't take care of me, and so I'm going to vote for anybody uh, who talks differently, who wants to blow up the system. Now, at this point, from the vantage point of we're going to preserve American democracy, of course, that's not good news, right? Because I mean, if Trump succeeds in throwing his grenades against the system and he refuses to step down and he fires the military chiefs and tries to replace them with sycophants.
Mhm.
I mean, it is very deeply troubling. So I think what I would like to sketch out
Mhm.
is a positive vision for the country, and that of course assumes at this point, with political arithmetic, that
Mhm.
the Democrats would get the Senate, and of course a lot hinges on that. I mean, I'll talk about what it means
Yeah.
if it says Republican, but if they get the Senate, if there's a trifecta, there would have to be an aggressive agenda on, we would call it economic populism, essentially.
Okay.
Right. So it would basically, the first step measure would be stimulus package, right? And of course, the technicalities of rolling out the vaccine, which would be, there's an interesting trial with Pfizer, and maybe there's another company that has an promising drug. Um, then the next step would be forgiving student debt. Now that would presumably benefit a lot of urban voters. Well, for the rural voters, you need some kind of campaign as well. It could be mass public job creation, like
New
very
Deal,
similar.
something.
Exactly, a new deal, and you would presumably target rural areas or areas that have been neglected in the past. Um, I would say that, I mean, this is from my vantage point. I would like to see a universal basic income because I think it's the best way to to fit the individual needs of the of residents in different areas, and it's very important that it would be equally applied here. And actually, that would favor rural areas more than urban areas. And the reason is because you have high rent prices in the urban areas, but you still only get $1,000, right? So you could be, what could be happening is people would be more mobile and they could start to repopulate maybe outlying suburbs, or they could repopulate more rural areas. Um, there would be a massive house building program where you would basically loosen some of the strict zoning laws, and then you would build more houses maybe in urban areas, so maybe it would be easier for people from the outside to move in. So, like, I mean, it's gonna sound like a technocratic hogwash list here.
Oh,
Also, Medicare for all, by the way. I think guaranteeing healthcare to all people, I
yeah.
think, especially in the middle of a pandemic, a huge thing. Um, so it sounds like a technocratic hogwash list, but I think it will, all of the things that Dennis just mentioned with respect to, are we going to have, Trump, as ex-president building up a media empire, where basically he floods the airwaves with alternative facts,
Hmm.
alternative facts meaning lies, basically.
Hmm.
Um, you know, I think a lot of that would sort of be toned down as a result of, you could say, a reconfiguration of American capitalism to be more populist. So I think now is the time to sort of bang on that piece of agenda, and you know Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, Andrew Yang from the outside. I mean, those would all be allies to sort of push us in that direction and hopefully prevent us from jumping full scale into authoritarian dystopia.
Mm-hmm. Or post-democracy, right? Or they call it illiberal democracies,
Yeah, that's
right?
very Zakaria. Yeah, yeah.
Larry, I think you make a point. The Democratic Party needs to have a plan, and it may be technocratic. It may have to be not just at the federal level, but I think implemented state or local. What I'm curious about, if from a political standpoint, if the Democratic Party also needs a new utopia. And I know this is broad, what exactly a utopia means, but on the one hand, you have a political plan you would like to implement, like you said, maybe some kind of basic income, expand the social safety net, or repair the infrastructure, give hope to the new generation, of people that are in college, debt relief. But I still don't hear a utopia. I don't know. I, you know what I mean? It sounds technocratic. These are very technocratic plans, and they are essential. But I think something what guides parties is also something.
A narrative. You're looking for a
Yeah,
narrative.
for Obama, it was like this idea of hope. Then sometimes people go back to expanding the American dream, or retrieving the American dream, it's also essential for political parties to, build mobilization. So that's always been a difficulty, right? Because the local and state and federal, there are different levels, and I think we often immediately to the federal as the place where we think politics is. But at the state level, it's very unclear. And then at the local municipality level, I sometimes notice that there's absence of participation. Even here locally where I live, it's rare for people to think of municipality as a good place to also do things. I don't know, but that's my criticism. I think it's so up at the federal level, as everything has to happen at the federal level. And that's true. That's where a lot of the power is. That's where the political power is. That's where the Senate is. That's where the House of Representatives is. But I'm curious if there's, I don't know. It's ambitious. I think what you say is ambitious. It seems like you think the Democrats should shift a little further center left, right? And don't get trapped in the center. Don't get trapped in the center. If you get trapped in the center, then you start to lose your message again, and you start sounding like light Republican, and then you lose again. So the center, I think, is a trap, to be honest. I think it's a trap. If people move too quickly to the center just by assuming that they can gain more votes, then they might as well be an opposition again, an opposition party. Now, there's one more thing I want to say. A lot of this is maybe what Dennis talked about. There's also social psychology aspect we haven't really talked about yet. What I mean by social psychology is the role of being an opposition party versus the role of being a governing party. And I think what has happened in the United States, there is a tension or confusion over one's role in government. And I see this sometimes not just with Democrats or the opposition, seen as the opposition, but also with the Republican Party. I can't tell if they are an opposition party, a ruling party, or a reactionary party. I sometimes can't tell by the style of how the politics is done. So I think that's a social psychology problem where parties don't know their roles. In a way, maybe it's done intentionally. I don't know if you ever heard of Eric Olin Wright. He had this distinction of contradictory locations, contradictory class locations. I think the same happens in the American political system. It's the contradictory party locations. The parties confuse. They say they're opposition, but yet they're ruling, or they are ruling and they opposite other way around. I see this all the time happening here in Texas, for instance. There's, I mean, conservatives, Republicans run pretty much the state, except I mean, for governorship, it's been a Republican since Ann Richards. I think Ann Richards, 1992. But it sounds like it's a party that assumes that it's in opposition, even though it's governing. It's the ruling party in Texas, but it uses this idea that Washington is Democrat, liberal Congress. So I think it confuses even the Texas residents who they're fighting, and like the difference between state level and federal level, local level. They confuse them literally. I don't blame the voters. Maybe sometimes the parties potentially do that, So I think the idea of the role of an opposition party, the role of a governing party, often gets kind of, I don't know, mixed together, and it confuses. And I don't know if that's a strategy in politics. I don't know if that's done intentionally, to confuse people that this is the governing party. They're in charge of state government. Okay, the governor is a Republican. Most of the state legislature is predominantly Republican, like in a red state, right? And then but the federal level, the Congress is Democrat, right? So then they have to be in opposition towards the Democrats at the federal level, but they are the often ruling party at the state level, right? So I wonder if that causes, do y'all understand what I'm getting at? It causes.
I understand what you're getting at.
It causes confusion in roles, and you can manipulate roles, and there's a kind of, maybe it promotes false consciousness or dislocation. People don't know who the ruling party is, or they think that's the opposition. The opposition is the ruling party. Okay, I'll leave it there.
Yeah. What you described is also somewhat popular in the reverse, particularly inside of some very populist leaning left states. So in Massachusetts, there's a constant belief that the rest of the country is too conservative. And that is a feeling that I got, at least when I was following the races that were going on inside of Oregon and Washington State. It seems pretty common there as well. So is it intentional? Yeah, I think it is. And I think part of the reason why it's intentional is because government always moderates itself to some degree as it approaches the national level. Say what you will about how you elect your people and how conservative your district is or your state is. Once you get to a certain level, the rule is that you can't be too far either as a conservative or as a progressive, otherwise you find yourself isolated. For instance, AOC, she's very prominent, she's very popular, she's not going to be writing any laws that are wholeheartedly embraced by the Democratic Party. Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren face the exact same thing in the Senate. And there is the Republican contingent that also will not see any form of broad popular support for their policies. So the center being a trap is probably the most interesting thing to discuss here, because the center, you can make the argument, is what brought Biden into office right now. Because he did have the highest vote totals in history, and he wasn't exactly running as Bernie Sanders 2.0. And his VP was chosen among a middle-of-the-road Democratic constituency. If it was looking for other candidates that were either of minority status or of women, there were plenty more who were strongly progressive in their outlook. As in, he could have chosen Stacey Abrams to be his VP. He could have chosen any number of people, but he chose someone who was very safe. And there was a recent article that was put out by Politico, taking a look at the future cabinet of Joe Biden. And it says some progressives, some moderates, some liberals, and even a few Republicans. And that seems to be the direction that he's going. So the question is the center a trap? The center has to be a trap to a certain extent because you're trying to represent more than your own party.
Mm-hmm.
And when you do that, you end up needing to make space for people who do not like you and probably don't support your policies and will definitely disagree with you.
Mm-hmm.
And will they even come under your tent when the option is instead to be with the other guys' teams, have someone who is more like you, and you don't need to make any compromises to join the center because you have the right? I don't know the right way to go about this. I also don't know the right way that that Biden will be able to create his coalition of the reasonable to maintain a centrist position and then also engage in some of the more populist stuff. Because if you take a look at Biden's platform, he might not have been marketing himself as Bernie Sanders, but his platform is arguably the most liberal we've had in a very long time. He has this image of being a moderate, of being a blue-collar worker who's trying to take back a certain amount of people that were seemingly abandoned by old school democratic principles, but I'm unclear how exactly he'll be able to shift to be an economic populist. Maybe he can be an economic populist in a way that doesn't require any association with liberalism. But at that point, it is self-defeating. So the center is a trap, but the trap is in some ways still the thing that got him into power in the first place. And in this very same type of argument, when the Republicans started taking seats inside the House, there was a very brief rebellion against Nancy Pelosi. No one was taking up the mantleship of challenger, but the center of the party was furious with the idea that they were losing because they had been told and informed that not only were they winning, but they were landslide winning. But if you take a look at any of the recent publications by Politico or The Hill that has to deal with Nancy Pelosi, they were very surprised to find out that they had lost and how vulnerable they were. And a lot of them are trying to distance themselves from what they view as more left-wing politics under Nancy Pelosi. And I need to ask you guys a question.
Yeah, go.
Larry, Mike,
Yeah.
Yes.
does Nancy Pelosi come across to you as a champion of progressivism and liberal values in the modern Democratic Party? Because if people are opposing her for being too left, what exactly does that say about us?
Well, it depends like whose perception it is. So in my perception, Pelosi is a centrist. I mean, I know that the argument is, oh, look at the district that she represents, the middle of San Francisco, right, which is one of the most liberal and progressive places. Silicon Valley. Yeah, but only up to a point, because it also depends like what do you mean by progressivism, right? So, in the Pelosi framework, it means social and cultural issues, right? So, what is your stance on gay marriage? What is your stance on abortion? What is your stance on advocating for Black Lives Matter and various social movements that are focused on cultural issues, right? And but when it comes to economic issues, I'm not too sure, because sure, I mean, okay, the House of Representatives under her leadership would vote for bills that are, you could say, expansive in social policy, right? Or that would lift the minimum wage, or that would expand health insurance and things like that. But she does it in a context where the Senate is Republican and Trump has been president, right? So, I mean, under those circumstances, I think there was an awareness that, look, we're not going to get this thing passed, but we're going to do it anyway because we want to signal to our base that that we're doing good. Mm-hmm. Now, the fire test is going to be that if there's a Democratic trifecta, right? So again, we're most optimistic hope on the remaining Senate seats. Um, would she still retain the same vigor, towards progressivism? That is an open question, I would say, because then it becomes more complicated because it's not just her view; it's also, the centrists in the caucus, which is about maybe 40, 50 of them, maybe, um, who will then say, well, but, we can't do Medicare for all because I get lobbyist money from insurance company. Now, we can't really regulate the pharmaceutical companies because they're an important constituency in my district. Uh, so when push comes to shove, I mean, it could mean less. Um, but look, I mean, I've respect for people in power. I mean, I understand that you have to you know sometimes make trade-offs just to get things done. Um, but yeah, I would put an asterisk behind the sort of progressive label of democratic leadership.
And you, Mike?
Yeah, I'll be right back, y'all. Just a second.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, it's but so there was this interview with Chuck Schumer. There was just a few days ago, and you know he was asked about, well, what's the implication of Democratic presidency of Biden winning? Um, you know, should he be acting more like FDR, which is New Deal, big changes, or should he be sort of like a centrist status quo? And Schumer said, well, he should be like FDR, and we in the Senate are going to support him if it has to be. And but then the journalist, because he's like a left-wing journalist, right? So you'd be like, well, but you have been taking money from Wall Street, right? Because he's a New York senator, and of course, a New York senator has to arrange himself with Wall Street. Um, and and he gave the same response that Hillary Clinton gave 4 years ago when she was asked about the Goldman Sachs speeches, right? Which is, yeah, but it's not going to affect my vote, right?
I'm back.
I'm still going to be a progressive in my policies. I'm not going to promote big banks, but yeah, I'm going to take the money, right? Um, and yeah, that to me is just, I mean, so this is the political reality that we have in America, right? So you have a Republican Party where basically, the Mitch McConnell types, the Paul Ryan types, Kevin McCarthy, all these people, they're sort of like tax cuts for the rich, right? Loot the government in favor of the billionaire class, right? And then of course you have the leadership, like the Trump leadership, which is based on populist appeals, populist promises, and of course he sold out his voters. I mean, it's very important to say that, right? The manufacturing jobs didn't come back. Well, I mean, of course he was tougher on migration numbers coming down, but then that's going to depress the economy, which I think and but to see those demographic effects, it's going to take some time. So overall, I think Trump is definitely selling out the base. So the Republican Party is at the moment, the way it's constituted, not very populist. So then you're going to have to rely on the Democratic Party. But then, as we say, with the Democratic Party, you got the Biden centrists, you got the Wall Street Schumer types, and then yeah, you're going to have Elizabeth and Bernie, right? You're going to have two progressive senators. You're going to have the squad, right, in the House, AOC and people like that.
Uh, Yeah, good
But
point, Larry. I think what you're addressing is the dynamic of political roles themselves that certain people adopt. So, in the arena of politics, you can be an activist, you can be a professional politician, you can do nothing, you can just sit in a, uh, keep acquiring elections, you get reelected. This often happens. I don't want to point out in red states. I mean, there's some politicians, they don't even have to really do any campaigning because they're guaranteed a vote. I would assume that something like this even happens in blue states. I mean, so I'm curious if that creates a unique role dynamic, uh, which can also hinder, political progress. It could hinder democracy, because it goes back to what's the purpose of government? Does it go back to solving issues? Does it expanding the welfare state? I mean, I'm really sometimes confused about roles of politicians. I really am. And I'm not saying that's only a problem in the United States. It's a problem in Germany too. Uh, there's a disconnect sometimes between municipality, local, state, and federal. Okay, they have different interests. Even sometimes if the same party, they have different interests. I mean, as far as interests of what they will plan to do, but everything else seems to be more like political rhetoric, political communications, spin, just getting people to keep voting, keep maintain the seat if it's a safe seat.
so your
Right?
issue is like, does the lack of competition
Exactly.
cause stagnation? And
Stagnation.
yeah, so I have got a book.
You're gonna recommend a book? Okay, what's it called?
Yeah, so it's by Walter Scheidel. It's called "Escape from Rome: The
Oh,
Failure of Empire and the Road to Prosperity."
okay.
And
Sounds interesting. Escape from
yeah,
Rome.
so it has nothing to do directly with U.S. politics, but basically his thesis statement is that political fragmentation
Hmm.
in Western Europe was a precondition of the so-called Great Escape, which is basically the Industrial Revolution, economic development, colonial expansion, and of course, the you could say social progress, like increasing life expectancy and decreased infant mortality, et cetera, et cetera. Um, and then, so the comparison, you could say, empire was China and Middle East, which I guess, Arabic, Ottoman Empire, and so forth, where basically those, societies which were able to create a centralized bureaucracy from the very beginning, which basically is China. I mean, that's the main example of a civilization that did that. Um, they, yeah, so there's no fragmentation, right? Um, or if there was, it would easily be suppressed. I mean, you can have like a three kingdom period or even seven or eight kingdoms, but then they get quickly submerged into one. And in those cases, the empire will drive towards conservatism, right? Um, and so even in so there was one period in Chinese history under the Ming Empire. Zhang He was the guy's name. He was like an admiral, and he was sent out via ships to different places in the world. And the expeditions of the Ming Empire lasted for about 20 years, after which, there was Yongle was a leader that came up in a power struggle, basically destroyed all the ships, right? Said, we don't actually, we don't want to colonize anybody. We've got to fight our opponents, which are I guess the later the Qing emperors or the Manchu people, whatever so basically the enemy on the steppe in the north of us was a bigger worry to deal with, rather than trying to colonize other places. versus in the Western European context, it was a direct competition, right? So it's like, okay, the English are going to send ships. Well, but if the English decided not to do it, well, the Spaniards would do it, or the Portuguese would do it, the Italians would do it, the Germans would do it, the French would do it. So, and in that context, it's like, do you want to be the country that didn't send any ships, didn't try to expand, trading networks, the mercantilist regime, right? And yeah, and then you of course ask, well, what's the origin of the fragmentation, right? And so I think Scheidel goes back to geography, and that's the same argument that this other guy, Guns, Germs, and Steel. What's this
Larry
guy?
Diamond.
Yeah,
Jared Diamond. That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. It's like anthropologist, right? Anthropology.
Well, he's geographer, I think.
Okay.
And so and he has also a very geographic centric explanation.
Yeah.
Right. So in his argument, basically, look at the length of the coastlines in Europe, which is very long. Look at the islands and semi-islands, I guess peninsula. Look at the mountains, look at the rivers, look at the forests, all these natural divisions that allow Europe to be fragmented. And then China had sort of like the Great Plains, especially in northern China, which is the center, the gravitas of Chinese civilization. India is very interesting because the geography is like intermediary, so it's between like Great Plains of North China and the whatever internal divisions of the Western Europe. So, but to return back to the Scheidel argument, okay, well, why does he call it Escape from Rome? Well, because he said that Rome was the only Western empire which was successful in, unifying the European landmass. So basically, the argument would be that if for some reason Rome had retained state capacity, which is basically the ability to raise taxes, to maintain the army, to keep out the Germanic, barbarians, as they call them.
My ancestors.
Yeah, right. So if they were able to do that, or at least assimilate the Germans to adopt the Roman state system, to accept citizenship, etc. If that were possible, then Rome would have stagnated in the same way as China, basically. That's. I mean, it's a counterfactual argument. I mean, there's no, of course, we don't have the hard evidence for it, but it's plausible reasoning. But so I guess the idea is that you need fragmentation, and fragmentation means competition, to innovate and change things. Yeah. So
yeah, and too much fragmentation makes political management impossible, or makes it difficult to maintain system solidarity. I mean, is that what it goes? That you can have too much centrality, system becomes too centralized, right? Or if it fragments too much, then how people argue, for instance, that the United States American exceptionalism, it's such a large country, regions are so far apart, you can't really use a European example. European countries are closer together. The history of Europe is different. The history of the United States is different. I guess I'm going back to that old Sombart thesis and Lipset thesis, where the United States has always been an exceptional, different country. What you would expect a different political culture. It's difficult to use Europe as a model there, because it's totally the way the cities have developed differently, how far apart they are, how the states are large. Texas is large, right? When Europe had railroads, brought people together closer. And people said that also allowed socialists to organize better. They could move from one European city to the next. Whereas in the United States, I mean, think of the challenge of transportation, and people are so fragmented, so much individualism, they're individualized. I don't know if that's still a good argument. I mean, if you think about it, the U.S. is a large country. It's divided by region, right? Workers, yes, they have it bad, but here you have a lot of land. There's still this view that there's opportunities available in the United States. Everybody still thinks of the American dream as a viable goal. Maybe some are starting to doubt it. Real estate is still a lot of real estate. A bit, at least I think in the Midwest and the South. I don't know. The Northeast, is it rent is expensive? We don't know that, right? But
Yeah,
I think if like in the South, it's still like in Mississippi, and it's, I mean, okay, medium rent rates are doable if you are living outside of the city. But the reason why I bring this up is this old thesis that the reason why American politics is the way it is because of the problem of American exceptionalism. Political culture is different, and you look at Europe historically sort of evolved differently through feudalism, and everything's more centralized. The cities kind of grew together. Class relations, I think, also kind of became more conflict oriented.
Well, I
Right?
mean,
What do you think? We agree with that, or
America,
just yeah? Go ahead.
well,
Whereas
America,
class conflict in the United States seems to uh, be it's very trivialized. It translates into culture wars. You know what I mean? It doesn't translate into economic conflict. It translates into culture wars, abortion, guns, right? In European context, I always saw it as it still has this class conflict. There now, what's happening in Europe, I think, is they're starting to imitate American politics, right? With media, and they want to do similar like TV forums. At least that's what I'm observing when I watch German news, political talk. They often listen in to what's happening, obviously, in the United States. And those political parties, they start getting ideas, in Europe. They're like, maybe we can do what Trump did, right? And so that's on the right side of the political spectrum. On the left side of the political spectrum, I think it's substantially different in Europe and the U.S. What is the left in Europe is not what the left is in the United States. I just don't see any similarities. I could be wrong, but I just don't see any similarities. I don't know. Help me out here.
There
well,
aren't very many similarities between the Democratic Party and what would be considered left-wing politics inside of Europe. There just isn't. Even if you compare most center-right parties to the Democratic Party, you'd find a whole lot more similarities over there. One of the things that is typically brought up, almost as a little bit of a joke, is that conservative parties in the Anglosphere identify more strongly with the Democratic Party usually than the Republican Party. As in, the American body politic is more conservative. The question that is begged from that is why? Why is this system set up the way that it is? And in large part, you could look at a couple of different things. One argument is the idea that America, by providing a more traditionally conservative and militaristic blanket over the rest of the world, it liberated the body politic of smaller nations to pursue more of their efforts upon social welfare spending, less on traditionally conservative routes of governance. And the United States, as far as it was concerned in foreign policy-wise, was consistently from the 1940s straight until Trump was elected, a strong proponent of social integration, of the power of government to help reconstitute societies, think of the Marshall Plan. So there was very much an externalization not only of a security blanket, but also of a support for greater integration and greater infrastructure, social spending. So America helped build a world that it has been somewhat left behind by. Then there's also the legacy of different types of body politic. America never really had a traditionally revolutionary political spectrum. So if you think of the French Revolution and the American Revolution, these were very different revolutions. And if you take a look at the work of Hannah Arendt, she definitely this in her book, very originally named On Revolution. And one of the things that she points to is that very much inside of the United States, the form of left-wing politic is based around maximization of right, localized rights, whereas inside of more European contexts, more French Revolution, and to an extent more socialist or communist movements, it's a form of left-wing politic built around necessity. So providing for needs. And that's much less common inside of the American system.
Is
And
that like also this like positive negative liberty with
yep,
Berlin?
positive and negative liberty. There's also an entire thing that I wasn't even aware of until I read a book called Public and Private Liberty. It's weird.
Is it shift towards libertarian thinking? I'm curious. I don't. Is that a fair assessment? Libertarian.
The United States is far more libertarian.
Okay.
And we've even facilitated it to a certain point, as in liberal in the United States doesn't mean the same thing as liberal means inside of Europe either. Mm-hmm. In large part because liberal means more libertarian inside of Europe, whereas inside of the United States it's created a fractured discourse between more social democracy elements and more centrist moderate positions. So I wish I could say something definitive on how we're different, but those are some of the common ideas that typically get brought about. And the question then becomes class consciousness. America has a very strong class consciousness, but it's not proletariat and bourgeoisie, despite what Twitter might tell you amongst certain dispossessed urban young people. For the most part, it is middle class consciousness. The conceptualization that the United States is a country built of, for, and by members of the middle class, to the point where people who are desperately poor will say that I'm middle class, and people inches away from the top percentile of wealth will continue to say that they're middle class. Everyone in the United States seems to have that type of class consciousness, and that class consciousness is embedded in the idea of American exceptionalism and the American dream. The only way that you break down that idea of a middle class consciousness is when you dispute the American dream as attainable, i.e., there are systemic barriers preventing you from obtaining the American dream. It's those rich people over there, or it's this corrupt system over there. You are not middle class, or there's an opposition point to the middle class that you need to try to overcome. So that type of dispute mechanism is really the only way that I see large segments of the American body politic emerging in a way that it takes issue with the system almost as is, because we are, to a very real degree, actually representative of that myth structure still. We still live off of the embers of that myth. For the most part, the biggest problems seem to be those under the age of 35. If you were to take a look at people over the age of 35, from mostly Gen X upwards, wealth distributions, employment outcomes, it's not what you would see as despairing. Really, the only true forms of despair happen inside of far rural areas in the left behind narrative. Otherwise, people still have strong confidence. And if you take a look at Trump, one of the funnier things, Trump lost ground in a lot of different areas, and he gained ground primarily amongst minorities, but also primarily amongst the 35 to 45 age demographic. And I can't help but feel like there's a connection there. But I'm starting to ramble.
The 30 to 45 category, they're optimistic about the future of America.
I'm unsure if it translates to optimism, but I think it translates to a greater shift in support to Trump, and it was only like 2 or 3 points, so I don't want to oversell it. But the basic premise is that elsewhere he was losing support, but this is the one age demographic that he gained support. Gaining support everywhere, but the only averaged out age demographic he gained support in was the older than Gen Z and young millennials, 30 to
Oh.
45, something like that.
Well, he was destroyed among the younger millennials
Yes, he
and
was.
and the Gen Z.
Yeah,
Okay.
even the elderly turned against him. So older
Yeah,
folks
all
did
that,
as well.
yeah.
That's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. So with regard to terminology, I thought it was really interesting because
Yeah.
I mean, as sociologists, I mean, everything is about class for us. So,
The
uh,
salad bowl. It's
but
a salad bowl, Larry.
right.
Go
So
ahead.
the term middle class, I think, is somewhat obfuscating because in the European discourse, right? So you have the French term bourgeois, which even English speaking people know,
Mittelstand.
and then in German you have bürgerlich or
Or,
Bürgertum.
or Mittelstand. Mittelstand? Yeah. Bürgerlich,
Mittelstand.
yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
Mittelstand is also a little bit confusing. I think
Yeah.
so. Bürgerlich and bourgeois, I like these terms a lot because it's sort of invokes some more classic, Marxist, class conflict
Pe-
between laborers and owners
petty bourgeoisie.
of means of production. Yeah, right. And then if you're a petty bourgeoisie, then you're sort of like in the middle, right? So you're not a big capitalist employer who oversees a
You're a
lot of
kulak.
workers.
Well, that's
Yeah.
Larry. That's
Um,
exactly what Eric Olin Wright was saying. That there are contradictory class locations emerging, which create confusion in themselves. That's why
and
I was
that's what the
bringing that up.
politicians exploit, right? So if you're a Republican politician,
Yeah.
you're going to say, I'm going to support the petite bourgeoisie, which I mean, of course, in American language, it means small business, right?
Yeah.
I'm going to support the small business owners, with this measure, when in reality, I mean, if you drill down, you look at the details of tax policy, you'll see, well, actually, most of the money goes to the big corps, right? The big corporations. But you know, but in the they exploit the popular imagination, right? About, well, this is a country of the petite bourgeoisie, right? The small business owners, and we're gonna support them, right? Again, there's another point I think which Dennis didn't mention. I think it's very important to add. Um, I think I described this last time, which is I think that America is one of the few countries in the world, maybe the only one, where you have what I call socialist outcomes without socialist policies. And the socialist outcome, I mean, you have to define this. So this is what Mike talked about earlier, which is that, so a lot of white Europeans, so of course black slaves is a separate story, but a lot of white Europeans who came to this country as indentured servants, right? Which means they took out a bond basically to finance the passage to the U.S. Um, they could attain freedom when they landed here after paying off the bond, and then they could decide to work in a factory in whatever Massachusetts or the East Coast, or they could move to the interior, right, like to whatever Chicago, Iowa, and what all these other states that were about to be set up. And why is that very important? Well, because it's your ability to escape a potential exploitative capitalist employer that gives the laborers the structural leverage, right, against their employer. And what's the evidence for that? The evidence is the wages in the US were 3 times higher than in Europe. And that's of course the reason why you have millions of Europeans going to America rather than the other way around, right?
Mhm.
And so that's what I mean by socialist outcomes. And
Yeah.
now that's it's very important to state that because assuming that the socialist outcome no longer holds, and I think we have good evidence for the last almost 50 years, 45, 50 years of evidence that the outcome doesn't hold anymore. I mean, you see stagnation of wages. I mean,
Housing.
yeah, you see, yeah, like insufficient affordable housing, especially in the large cities where most of the jobs are. Um, and uh, and then but on the capitalist end, I mean, it's still okay, right? I mean, the profits are still there. I mean, there's business expansion. Like you don't have to rely on domestic markets necessarily. You could, invest in overseas, your capital. Um, so capital has become more footloose. Um, but you know, you could say the laboring class, doesn't necessarily gain from that. So, and what Dennis referred to as the embers on which we live on, which basically means the cultural stories. Um, we haven't collectively around to tell ourselves a new story about, you know, basically class relations in America, right? Which is to say that, we haven't allowed ourselves collect. I mean, of course, as sociologists, I mean, of course, we study this all the time, but I'm saying the general public, we haven't gotten around to think about, you know, can we tell ourselves, a story about class relations that would be more in line with our objective self-interest? And of course, I mean, you could then say, well, what do you mean by self-interest, etc. Okay, that's a fair debate to have.
Well,
Um,
you raise fruitful questions, Larry, and this whole idea of socialist outcomes, even though you don't have socialist policies, I think Bart made that same exact argument, and I'm going somewhere with this. I mean, you could think about the land capacity in the United States, the how easy it is, at least in the southern states, still to get a trailer, and a few acres of land. I actually have some European relatives that have done this. They have this dream of coming to the United States, and they don't really have that much money, but they look for some acres in Texas, and they start like a little mini ranch or something. Uh, to some extent, Europeans, there is this limitation of land. Real estate is extremely ridiculous. So that's like a socialist outcome just because of the structural differences, in a country like the United States, because it's large. Now, what we're seeing, though, with incomes not matching housing, this is totally going out of whack. The ridiculous amount required to purchase a home has gone through the roof. I mean, in most metropolitan areas. Um, Now with with this COVID-19, maybe it's kind of went down again. But yeah, I'm surprised why housing is not such a big issue, in the U.S. Especially because it's difficult for people to acquire it. And think of places like Seattle. I mean, it's a homeless crisis is crazy, right? So you're right. I don't know why Democrats sort of are shy on that issue, or they're worried they're going to be labeled rent control crowd or something, if they're worried that they're going to advocate public housing construction like in New York, but now something is going to have to be done. If it's cooperative housing, if it's some, it's I mean, the trailer park alternative is not the future. I don't think that's the future. If just building more trailer parks and just building more, what they call substandard housing situations where people live in RVs permanently, right? No, no. Then, but that's serious. It's a serious thing. Housing inequality. I don't know why Democrats are not so go after it. I don't know why. It's a serious problem. And even in red states, the working class can't afford rent. It's getting too expensive. And I'm curious how it is for students. They're moving back in, with their parents. But that may be the driving wedge. That's an issue like that, which I think would go beyond being Republican or Democrat, right? What do y'all think? A housing initiative? Sweden, the Social Democrats, they tried that. We're going to build 1 million homes, right? The state will. You think that will pass in the U.S. government building homes? Well, that's too left, too far to the left.
Well,
But
we built massive housing projects.
yeah,
It's just that they don't have the best reputation. They don't seem to address the underlying problems. And it doesn't actually change the incentivization structure. So how we solve homelessness inside of areas where homelessness is out of control seems to be almost an inverse relationship with how much money is spent on the homelessness issue. Because I think I read a statistic somewhere that suggested that if you were to just directly redistribute the money that is actually sent to people for solving the issue of homelessness, every single homeless person inside of the cities in California would receive something like $60,000. There's no reason why that shouldn't be translating into a situation where homelessness is reduced. But the homelessness rates continue to go up, as does absolute values. And I can't help but feel as though that there's a really bad adaptation of incentive structures where we're looking at right now. So the reason why I did this is because I actually live in a mobile home.
Oh, okay, cool.
Yeah.
Awesome. No,
My
no
family
disrespect.
does.
I wasn't.
And we are currently planning on moving,
Okay, good.
probably to another one.
In
So-
Texas, it's very common,
Yeah.
Dennis.
Yeah.
Texas, rural areas, not just mobile home communities, but RV trailer parks are very sometimes a reality for many people that
Oh,
live
yeah.
in Texas.
So,
So I don't know how it is in where you're at, what state, but as far as that's New England. Now, what are the regulations there? Are they tougher on mobile homes there, or are they? It seems I've seen in Texas. I've seen some really interesting.
I don't have anything to compare it to.
Okay.
So I
It's
can't
not like-
really tell you.
Okay.
I am a exile
Okay.
from the
excellent.
housing market into a different form of permanent housing.
Okay.
So
Awesome.
is it too left to talk about the idea of promoting housing works projects? No. Not in the United States. I think for the most part, the issue has to do with reputational factors and problems of outcomes. Because thus far, we've had a lot of issues with getting desirable results to a certain point where people have a resistance to providing more without some type of verifiable thing. And I'm unsure how to solve that. And when I think of mal-adapted incentivization structures, it actually leads me back to more or less something that both of you were saying, false class consciousness and money in politics. Now, here's something very interesting if we're just going about this through a mercenary Marxist class conflict perspective. Why are more rich people and more rich companies anti-Trump? Very strongly anti-Trump. If you take a look at money in politics, Trump was one of the first presidents in a while to win with less money than his opponents in 2016. And if you take a look at total expenditure outcomes this time around, I think it was something like 2-1, a little over 2-1 Democrat in favor of Republican. And a lot of that was corporate money. A lot of it was Wall Street. Most of it, or a very large number, was tech. The only places that seem to really still be strongly supporting of Republicans with regards towards big business are fossil fuels, energy.
Walmart.
Deregulation of oil companies and climate standards and things like that. Yeah.
Yeah, I even think Walmart is still relatively pro-Democrat, as in all of these large companies hedge.
They split it half. They split half to make it look like they're not biased.
Yeah. There's a certain hedging here.
Yeah.
So I'm unsure. I'm unsure if things are churning out the way that they are, primarily because it might just be that we've set ourselves up for failure to the point of changing our incentive structures. So things like college education, I think that it was oversold and overexpensive. As in, when you take a look at overhead costs of a university, and you take a look at rising tuition fees, and you take a look at outcomes for possessing of a degree, it's too expensive. I'm not even sure canceling the debt is really the right way to go about this. And if you take a look at expenditures rising, a lot of it has to do with administrative costs, as in the cost of going to a first rank university, an R1 university somewhere, is 4 times as expensive, but there's almost no movement in total number of professors. If you take a look at the PhD markets are getting particularly difficult, not just because of the pandemic. And if you take a look now at the overall balance sheets of universities, some guy in Harvard said something along the lines of 50% of universities will be experiencing substantial fiscal difficulties. I can't help but feel as though that we have established a series of expectations with regards towards getting an education that has in some ways warped the traditional pathways towards employment. This is definitely a hot take.
I'm going to
probably very
criticize.
hotly
Go ahead.
contested.
Dennis, I'm going to criticize you just for a moment.
Sure. Go
I
right ahead.
think you're right on something that's gone out of whack, but you're using a supply-demand approach. And
I am an economist.
Yeah, of course. Oh, you are. Okay, supply-demand. I think me and Larry, we had this discussion before with another guest as well. We could use supply-demand logic in any sector of employment. I mean, you can go to trucking jobs. There's now a need, for those jobs, so they're going to pay people more. And I don't downplay supply demand. There's always going to be macroeconomic factors that play a role. But with education, I think it's a special sector. I think it has to do with thinking, thoughts, culture. And some people use the supply demand argument to really they're anti-intellectual. I'm not saying that to you. I don't think you're anti-intellectual. But I've sometimes seen this turnaround. Yeah, it's worthless. We need to just fire everybody that's an academic. They need to learn how to do a real job. I think that's the role where the state comes in. That's precisely why the state should come in. So higher education should not be operated like supply demand. And it's based on market moving this way or that way. That it's autonomous. It's supposed to be autonomous. It's not supposed to be affected by toilet paper rush or that's why it's supposed to be separated. It's not supposed to be dictated. Again, we can talk about employment when they exit university. That's another question. But the university itself is supposed to be kind of an autonomous institution that's protected against market pressure, or market decisions. It's hypothetical. It may not always work the same way. Sometimes I think sometimes states want to organize it as if it were. You could try to make it compatible to anything else out in the market. That's where the mistake is. I think education is not the same as a commodity. I think it doesn't have the same use value. It's totally different. The things that we produce may not even produce something sometimes, so I think I'm there. I'm like Carl Polanyi, Carl Polanyi said there was false, fictitious commodities. What do you say? Land, labor, and nature. I would put education down there too. I mean, I hope it's not a commodity. If we turn it into one, then we got a problem. It's like turning theology.
It's always been a commodity, though. So the idea of this old, small place where the only thing you go to is to think and produce thoughts and to engage in intellectual development and maturity, that's been dead since it was marketed that a college degree gained you entry to the middle class or the upper middle class. And that was a transition that started happening in the 70s. In the 70s, you started seeing an expenditure of people going to college. Every now and again, I still hear some of my old advisors telling me about how cheap it was to go to college back in the day.
All right.
The idea that college is something separate from the economy, separate from fiscal expenditures, separate from the overall expenditures of the population is no longer tenable when you start off a population that if they pay for a college degree outright, they have bought a house that they will never live in. And at that point, there needs to be a substantive argument right underneath the surface whether or not that incentive structure has allowed for them to live a more prosperous life. So I'm going to ask you a question.
Okay, me or
If
Larry?
I
Well,
know
both
that
of
Larry is definitely on your side with regards to this one. We've had a couple of chats about whether or not to treat education as a commodity. Mine is we can make the philosophical statement that education shouldn't be, but it
Okay.
is. And if we treat it as is, then we need to deal with the incentives going out of whack. So let's assume that you have spent 4 years of your life developing yourself in such a way that you are able to profoundly engage in certain thought topics, but you find difficulty obtaining substantive employment that has any degree of relationship with your actual expenditures to obtain it. Let's say, for instance, since we have degree inflation, you are getting a job that you probably could have gotten right out of high school, but the cost was anywhere between $150,000 to $250,000. Not only did you lose the 4 years that you would be getting of income, so you've lost 4 years off of your career,
Mhm.
you have a house that you'll never live in. And I need to stress that because we're talking about a lack of housing market, more people living with their parents, a lack of an ability to really redistribute the economy in a way that is supportive of this structure. How much of that has to do with government subsidized debt? What's the right way to put it? I don't want to make it too strong, like debt servitude or bondage, but
Mhm.
you see a very large inflow of government subsidized debt towards highly urban, localized locations with a high increase of local housing costs because so many young people need to live there in order to go to these university towns. And then when they leave, they've lost out on 4 years of education, and their job prospects are not necessarily all that good, which is why every now and again you'll come across a joke saying, she's a wonderful librarian, she has a PhD in English literature. Or, I understand your degree, you have a wonderful degree in how to become a Starbucks barista. Now, these are very pejorative, but they represent something that's going wrong with how the economy is turning out. So so this is my question to you. If every single student that has been going to college was instead granted a one-time lump sum of $150,000 to $250,000 instead of a
Basic income.
college degree, what would have been their fiscal economic outcomes? Would they have been able to afford the house that they cannot right now? Yes. Almost certainly yes. Not unless we see an overinflation or overvalue of the market, because I could buy a house right now in a mobile home park for $20,000 or $10,000. So even if it's not white picket fence, suburb, car, marriage, and a trick pathway to a career inside of the city that a lot of people get sold on, it still would be home value. It still would be equity. And this is most pressing primarily for minority groups because they had less equity to start with. So you have negative equity, negative value being produced. And I can't help but wonder how to deal with this in the long run. So, how much of this issue has to deal with everything just simply being wrong and us needing to fundamentally rework all of society so that it matches with it? And how much of this might just have to do with the fact that we are setting up, particularly those people who were sold on the idea of a college education equals middle class or better future prospects, instead not receiving that? If anything, if we're talking about a breakdown of the social contract between the myth-making structure, it is the declining value of a college education in a marketplace. We can say that it has definitive value outside of that, and of course we will, because I am someone trying to get into a I love academia to a certain extent, not just for what it's capable of doing, but for what it has already achieved. I am 100% biased in favor of it. My issue is,
Go ahead.
how has things changed to the point where we may actually be witnessing the facilitation of a crisis and then being unsure how to deal with it because of that?
Can I take a crack at it, Larry?
Sure.
I take the position of Dalton Conley. He wrote an article a few years ago about proposing that instead of doing admissions, that we set up higher education admissions like lottery, and whether or not that would have better outcomes or different kind of outcomes. The way it's structured, right now, admissions, especially Ivy League schools, very highly competitive. There's a lot of money just on the admission side. But I'm not saying I would experiment there when it comes to admissions being open. Then there's no class unfairness. Everybody should then be able to go to Ivy League, or if they want to go to a regional university. But this, so I'm open there. The lottery idea that Dalton Conley kind of talked about, he suggested, that there are these entrenched class, mechanisms in place, and if you just did a lottery, like you did a scratch off at a gas station, like I don't know if you could do that for
Well, but I mean,
like the
Conley's
Hunger Games,
solution.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
I think Doug Conley in that proposal, I think he's scratching the surface, and I think that
Oh,
Dennis,
did I
Dennis
get it
has
wrong? Was it about right? Was it about right? He said, I remember reading it.
so it would be a marginal improvement. I haven't encountered Dalton's argument there, but
Yeah, it was.
but there's a deep issue here. So first of all, I would say that if we distinguish the normative from the positivist, I would say that I think the three of us agree normatively, right? That higher education is there for pleasure, enjoyment. I mean, even our 3-hour seminar that we have over Skype today,
Cultural,
right, is already
cultivating, right?
Is already an indication for where our what our time preference is, right?
We're building our own utopia, intellectual utopia.
Exactly, that's right. So okay, we'll just so we'll box up the normative aspects of higher education and learning and put it to the side, and I think we have to address Dennis' positivist concerns.
Okay.
So my views about higher education and the job market has been and will forever be influenced by Randall Collins.
Okay.
And I think we might have brought him up last time, but
Credential Society, right?
Credential Society, which basically
right.
like Dennis already summarized the argument, right? Which is that credential inflation, which means people are getting degrees, but they're worth less and less because the job market, in terms of the skill requirement, does not change, right? I mean, or it changes to some extent, but usually, like you need a few people at the top, right? Like you need a few doctors and you need a few engineers, computer programmers. I mean, there's a list of occupations with a high skill, right? So that certainly, like 20 years ago, there was almost no one who was an AI researcher, right?
Mm-hmm.
And today, because of the improvement of computer capabilities, we're going to see a growth in AI researchers, things like that. Okay, so I'm not going to deny the high skill and that demand will exist. Mm-hmm. But then for the rest of it is we see a shrinkage overall in, you could say, middle skill occupations. And I think what the Census Bureau means by that is like secretaries, people doing data entry, kind of like routinized things that you could learn easily. Those occupations are basically destroyed by automation. And then what are you left with? Well, you're left with a large group of basically low-skilled labor. So I think so. Dennis' example with the baristas, I think, would capture that extremely well. Uber driver might be another example because now it used to be as a taxi driver you had to memorize street names. Now you just have a GPS and app. So that's the occupation that's expanding. And then, well, if you only expand the low skilled, well, then guess what happens with the wages is that because they are replaceable, so the wages will be very low. And then it's like, well, but then is higher education the problem? And I say, no, it's not the problem. I think higher education is the it's it's like the thing that papers over the problem, right? I mean, I don't think necessarily that it is actively making it worse. It certainly, I mean, you could argue the student debt, is making things worse. But I had a conversation with Randy about this too, and he said that, well, as long as the federal government is insuring the loans, right, which means that any non-repayment of student loan debt, which is effectively a way of saying you get the education for free because you're not really paying it back, right? Um, the loss would be on the books of the federal government. And the loss of the federal government, it's kind of like, like basically by refusing to enforce the debt collection, that's basically you have indirectly and in a very cruel manner, of course, because it's a psychological burden to have debt. You have subsidized higher education from the federal government. So, and so higher education, I think, in this nexus with the job market, it's papering over the structural conditions of our economy, but it's not the cause of the problems in our economy.
Base superstructure, right?
Yeah. So
no, that's where you're going.
Right. So what we have to do is, you're right. So I guess so what I would say is, if what we're concerned about is a job crisis,
right,
then we would have to do something with respect to jobs, right? Specifically about jobs. And so that means two things in terms of solution. It means either a public job creation scheme, so we're back to New Deal, right? So, and I don't know what the jobs would be. I mean, it could be like, you know, cleaning the street or something, or
building stadiums like they did.
Building infrastructure or something like that. I don't know, digging ditches.
Parks. I think they build parks.
Yeah, whatever it is, we're gonna figure out something, right? That's one, and then two is universal basic income. Because so if we have UBI, then we can. Then what I would expect to happen is a reinvigoration of higher education in the following form. In that, I would expect that credential inflation would decline because fewer people would go to college.
That's true.
Right? Because there's an exit option now from the labor market. And then, the only, you could say, idiots who decide to stay in higher education are the three of us, and people who are of similar caliber, right? Yeah. Those who really actually would enjoy the educational experience, right?
All right.
1 second, I'll be right back.
No problem. No, you make a good point, Larry. I could see it taking a strain off of the problem regarding there's lots of people going in education, higher education. They're lost. They don't quite maybe know. Maybe they, like you said before, maybe for them it is a kind of secondary welfare, I would say, benefit. It starts, so like you said, if we had basic income, there would be, first of all, that guarantee you had basic income, and then you wouldn't have to, look for innovative ways to acquire some kind of a subsidy, right, or some kind of a way to earn your bread or earn your income.
Well, that's how Randy called it. He like our current strategy, he called it education Keynesianism, right?
Oh yeah. Oh really?
Right. So right. There's like so there's a general Keynesian term, right, which is about the government pumping money into the economy.
You called it educational Keynesianism. I'll write it down. That sounds interesting.
So it's in the book. Does capitalism have a future? It's edited by Immanuel Wallerstein.
He's dead. Yeah, he died.
Yeah, they died last year, but it was published in 2013, right? So
Does
it's not,
capital have a future? Okay.
this capitalism have a future.
No,
And yeah, so you have traditional Keynesianism, you have military Keynesianism, as you might know, that the fact that we have a military industrial complex, and he uses the word education Keynesianism, where basically like if you look at a lot of urban economies, right? Alan Malik would be one of these people, like an urban sociologist. What you find is that the eds and meds is the main industry, right? So yeah, there's a bunch of cities where it's so obvious, right? Like Cleveland, I think, or no, in Ohio. I was there for a conference like 2 years ago, and there's a bunch of cities across the country, medium to large sized cities,
mhm.
where eds and meds, which means higher education and hospitals, are the main drivers of employment.
Mhm.
I mean, in Philadelphia, I went to Penn, so I should know the numbers pretty well. The largest private sector employer is University of Pennsylvania.
Mhm.
So it's not just, of course,
It's
faculty.
public or private? Is it public? It's
Well, it's private. It's private.
Oh, it's private. Okay.
It's a private institution,
Uh,
but it has a budget that's like larger. Let me say maybe twice as large as the city of Philadelphia, right? And so it wouldn't be surprising that Penn would have more employees than, say, the city of Philadelphia. And it's not just faculty and administrators. I mean, you have all the security guards and dining hall, and so, I mean, there's a whole list. There's a coterie of
yeah.
people that you would need in a university, right? So, and that to me, well, what does it suggest to me? It's that it said, well, higher education. Without higher education, our employment crisis would be even worse. Is what I would say. I mean, so I'm not saying our employment picture is great, but
Yeah.
without it, it would be even worse. I think
I
that's how
I could go ahead, Dennis.
It seems to me that there's an ingrained counter argument to that, though, because we can walk back just a little bit, and I will apologize if you've addressed this
No, that's fine.
before I popped back, but with regards towards things like the housing crisis, the extreme difficulty to possess a job in an urban environment that is able to pay for your cost of living, I believe that by having an urban college campus with a very large number of employees and a very large student base that is there partly or largely as a result of government subsidy, you end up creating a form of incentive structure that makes it far more difficult for ordinary people living in that area to continue to do so. So, say for instance, we're in Silicon Valley and we're talking about Stanford. How many people within that environment are students, faculty or administration, or people whose primary reason for being there are students and faculty to provide them with goods and services?
Mhm.
So if they were to be somewhere else or in a diminished capacity, what would happen to the overall cost of living? It would go down. What would happen in that type of situation? And it's almost impossible for me to fully accept the idea that you have more opportunities and more employment in an area where you're already dealing with an oversaturation of those to the point whereby it results in high levels of unemployment and a high threshold for poverty. There is no reason in my mind that I can conceive of that there are certain cities inside of California where you qualify for housing assistance if you make over $100,000. It just doesn't make sense to me. So something about our incentivization structure is adding on to ordinary geographies. So ordinary economic geography A way to put this would be you have a high density area around Silicon Valley because it's much cheaper to house large hubs of information into small areas. You don't need a lot of people there, but you are dealing with large numbers of capital because capital isn't represented in physical objects anymore, but instead can be represented in forms of intangibles. So you end up seeing a hyper importance of certain forms of the economy and a hyper importance of certain forms of city urbanization and urban wealth because it's not tangible. But with regards to the university, I can't help but wonder, you'd have fewer people inside of Philadelphia or fewer people inside of New York City or fewer people inside of Boston. They would be in a more rural environment. And then you would see the geography of the economy adapt because the primary drivers of an economy are usually young people. And if you had more young people out inside of the countryside that are of employment opportunity, and they still need to eat, they still need to work, they still need to have things happen, and there's no longer an incentive structure that forces them into a situation or an environment that would result in a greater, at the very least, a promise of greater returns, then you would have something else happen. As in, you would see greater economic development in more rural environments. And you would arguably see that with fewer people who are overqualified to do relatively low-skilled labor inside of cities, well, then people would need to reach out to the people who've been left behind inside of the cities. Because there are plenty of people who live in almost borderline condemned apartments, people who are basically homeless even if they don't qualify as homeless. And you would have opportunities open up for them because then they could be absorbed into the structure that they are being excluded from, because if you're in a city with UPenn in it, you have dozens, if not, no, you have dozens of thousands, tens of thousands of individuals who are college educated by one of the best universities in the world, all available to work for you for cheap as a part-time job or as an intern or as a fresh grad looking for an opportunity and unwilling to leave behind the network that they have within that city. So I can't escape from the idea that that the argument that the university there generating employment for people within inside of there is in a sense parasitic off of the overall problem of urbanization. That if you're able to remove that, you'd have something else take its place. Now, I understand that I have sold none of you on this.
No, I'm
I
trying
have a
to think
very
of,
skeptical view.
are you supportive of Keynesianism? You don't think you think it has adverse effects, and you think it would do more damage than good. It would not increase employment. Like just think of people at a campus consuming, eating, housing.
Mhm.
Does this not have a economic effect around that
Oh,
area?
it definitely does have an economic.
But you're saying it creates problems because it takes housing
There's such a
away
thing
from the
as
regular
too
people?
much Keynesianism.
Okay.
There's such a thing as an optimal threshold of inputs for outputs. So if you're trying to generate additional people to move to a city that is already experiencing a housing crisis,
Like
then you do
Seattle.
not see positive outcomes.
Like
What
Seattle.
you see is the importation of a class of more highly skilled labor, displacing the local population because they are in a sense priced out of it.
That's what happened in
Their
Amazon.
their human
Seattle.
capital isn't as good, so they aren't able to compete as well for the local jobs.
Mm.
And they will be competing for scarce housing resources.
What if you tax the corporations that cause the effect? That's
Well,
what they
that's
were
the
trying to do
thing.
with
Are we
Seattle
gonna
City.
True.
Seattle
So
City
are we
Council.
going to tax UPenn for having a campus and a whole lot of people inside of that position? No, we're subsidizing that.
Yeah.
So again, I'm definitely not against higher education. It's just that I'm also not saying that this is a cause. I also need to walk back any idea that I'm saying that education is a cause of bad things happening. I'm just saying that there's a adverse incentive structure that seems to be contributing towards the erosion of positive economic outcomes. Because if the issue is high housing prices inside of a city, you have two options. One is you can artificially increase the number of housing projects there, but which then begs the question, how do you make it cheap enough, or how do you get those people employed? Or you reduce the pressure on the housing market and the employment market by reducing the overall population. And this is something that you'll actually find in Scheidell's work, only in a much grimmer context, the Great Leveler. The idea that wars and pandemics and famines are the only thing that results in economic redistribution of wealth. Well, you don't actually need to kill anyone to get this outcome. You just need to have fewer people in a highly siloed, very geographically limited area. Because if there wasn't that type of subsidization, you would have fewer people there. Now, granted, everyone's always going to try to go to UPenn, but how many people can afford UPenn if they can't get a government-subsidized loan? You
Okay.
get enhanced class issue there, certainly. But you would have a different type of structure of employment within the geographic area of that university. And there are some universities that have essentially built cities entirely around the idea that there is going to be inflows of capital, inflows of young people, inflows of artificially cheap, artificially high-skilled labor in a closed environment. And when you see corporations try to mimic this, you'll find places like Amazon and Google and Apple try to get the most highly skilled people to join them in a very compact area and then subsidize it. And you see very similar effects with large corporations with high skilled labor moving into an environment whereby it ends up creating displacement effects. And you can see almost the exact opposite by a Walmart or some other form of store where you see a large company go into an area and they're able to create artificially cheap products that then outprice and outcompete local population sectors. It's the reverse of that effect.
Mm-hmm.
The entire thing is that it just disrupts the equilibrium to the point where ordinary citizens in an urban environment are increasingly pushed out because they aren't as highly skilled and they have too much competition. So how do we solve this one? I don't know. I like universities. I like subsidization for it.
Isn't that the same thing like gentrification then? I guess.
College universities are gentrification.
Yeah. I mean, it's just the same, I guess, concept.
The same phenomenon. So whenever you go to a place that's called a gentrifying neighborhood, it's usually young college grads leaving the campus, moving into a relatively impoverished area, and then building it up. As in DC, gentrification is incredibly linked to GW, American University, and Georgetown. As in, you just have a bunch of people who are in this who want to stay in DC because DC has a lot of jobs, so they'll move to an area, and as they move to an area, they increase property value, and they invite more people of a similarly highly skilled, younger demographic. And when they do so, the housing properties go up, the ability for local people to afford it go down, and they leave. Having a university is an inbuilt generation mechanism for gentrification.
Okay, so with regard to your positivistic analysis, I think you are spot on. I mean, I think I can subscribe to all of your points. My disagreement would be the counterfactual that you paint, right? So the counterfactual being, the natural equilibrium is that people decide to move to less densely populated areas where the rent is going to be cheaper, where people, even if they receive a lower nominal wage, the real wage might be higher because the cost of living goes down, etc. I don't agree with that counterfactual, at least in the absence of UBI. But of course, if you add UBI, then I think that changes a lot, because then people are mobile, can take their purchasing power along with them, right? So if you just say, under the status quo assumption, let's squash the universities, let's stop the subsidization. I mean, potentially, right? Just as a thought experiment.
I have become death, the destroyer of the academy.
Yeah, just as a thought experiment, because we wanted to test what the effects are, right? That okay, what would then happen? I don't think would be the positive picture that you paint. I mean, the urbanization, it creates inequality. Gentrification is part of urbanization, and the way how to deal with that um, is either aggressive government redistribution, which takes the form of UBI or some other social service. Like for instance, making higher education free at the point of service. Um, or it would be some systemic redistribution of power, right? Where basically you would transform people into owners. I mean,
Yeah.
like for instance, if you wanted to, I mean, the modal form of housing in America is renting, right?
Or cooperative housing.
Right.
Are you getting
So
at?
you're a renter, you're the landlord, but of course, but the
Yeah.
ideal solution would be what Mike suggested, which is do cooperative housing, where basically, let's say, you move into a new building, right, a new apartment building, which has recently been constructed, and you would pay, an elevated rent at the beginning because, you have to cover the construction costs. And then over time, when you pay that off, it's just you just have the maintenance costs, which should be lower. Um, and then you don't have, greedy landlords, who could sort of, charge you whatever the heck they want. So that would be, you know, a direct solution to the housing problem. Uh, and then with respect to the job structure, well, that's the really hard one. And I think the job, that's a nut that you directly have to crack, and not get lost with in the weeds with demonizing universities, right? And I think uh, the, the nut to crack, public job creation, UBI. I think that's the conversation I want to have. I mean, I, not dismantling the universities.
Okay, all right. I will not.
Austerity.
I will not push this too far,
All
but
right.
I will still say that even in your response to me, there was still the ability to play a devil's advocacy position. So, for instance, it's very difficult for me to conceive of a situation where a reduction in competition for wages will not see greater ability for people to obtain wage results, or a reduction of people competing for housing will not result in an increase of people who are able to afford it or able to obtain it. So it's difficult for me to say that, but okay, we will put that in a box and we'll put it to the side because I don't think anyone here is seriously saying that we need to dismantle universities. And we'll just put it over there. So with regards towards ways to increase housing or increase jobs, if you're going to have an artificially large population inside of an environment that doesn't mesh with the available employment opportunities, then the only way for you to have any form of sustainability there is through redistributive mechanisms. And the redistributive mechanisms not only takes place in where things are artificially high, but where things are artificially low. So artificially low would be areas of very high skilled, very high profit areas of employment, but it also has a counterpart in economically depressed areas. So you need people themselves are generators of capital. So if there aren't people there capable of generating capital, and you just have an aging location with fewer young people and fewer employment opportunities opening up, then you get the left behind problem. So you have a structure that is out of whack still. And the question which is begged is what causes it to be out of whack? So we're going to put aside artificial subsidization, which is very much an argument that would make Steve happy if he was here. But we'll put that
Right.
there.
He's
But
a pussy
instead,
when it comes to going on podcast. But okay.
I know, Steve.
but
I know, Steve.
but the way to go about this otherwise would be, are there jobs available that just aren't showing up? So can telecommuting become the revolution that we need?
Informal.
Or is redistribution necessary because given the way that things are, it is impossible to conceive of an employment program that isn't just an elaborate form of redistribution anyways to take care of this. Because
Yes, yeah.
if
Can
we're
I
all
interrupt?
going to
Go
play
ahead.
Keynes,
Yeah.
and Keynes is going to try to do something by saying it doesn't matter what you pay someone. You could pay someone a full wage to dig a hole in the ground, and their wage is at the bottom of the hole. So just bury money, and then you dig it out, and that's your job, essentially. That's just a form of artificial UBI. It's an employment
Well,
that
actually,
doesn't
it would be
necessarily.
better to just pay them money and then do whatever
Yeah,
they want,
it,
right?
it would be
Yeah.
better to pay money and then allow people to go off and explore their own forms of employment opportunities or their own way to create expenditures with their money because they'll already have it. Like, I already said I'm a fan of UBI a couple of times. So if we're going to try to go about it, that's one way to do it. One thing to bring up is that given this, oh, you want to say something, Mike?
Yeah, I do have a question. Since
Sure.
you're more grounded in economic analysis, how do you account for informal housing and informal labor? The impact that has on the formal economy or formal housing. It's a really interesting question, because does everybody know what I mean by informal labor?
Yeah, I definitely know.
Like, I mean, how do you account for that?
I wish I still had the book on my bookshelf because I was looking
Yeah.
at it to just go
No,
like
this is
this.
actually in my area of research where, you have the rise of informal housing precisely also tied to lack of available formal housing, and people are going into, this living as squatters in a developing world. I would argue in the global north, in the United States, informal, you might think of trailer parks and RVs turned into permanent housing. It's a new kind of housing market that is a subs below the regular kind of housing market, that develops below it. And I'm thinking there's more money being driven in that area. I could be wrong. Maybe the what do you call it? No, I lost my line of thinking. The up end housing, there's fewer of those people that can afford that, and it stays often empty. Luxury housing, things like this, and then there's an overwhelming amount of people that go into the low income. When I sometimes, for instance, drive around, I'm just observing in my own community. You can see the whole supply demand thing is out of whack because there's not as many people living in the luxury housing, and everybody's living in the low end, and it's overcrowded. There's 4 or 5 families maybe living in a space. I'm curious how we haven't thought of that. How there's what's happening where people going to informal housing, it's putting more money in that end, and not as then we have these empty luxury buildings, these empty, nearly empty, vacant. I see this around my whole neighborhood. I don't know what effect it has on y'all's neighborhood, but right now,
Let's call them ghost cities.
yeah,
So this is the classic Chinese problem of building housing projects that no one can afford to live in, and there are no jobs there either. So I suppose one way to say this is what happens when you just build homes, but there's no internal economy, and no one can afford the houses, and what you get are ghost cities, cities that almost no one lives in except for people responsible for making sure that everything doesn't fall apart. And that's a quintessential Chinese problem.
Well, I don't get me wrong. I see the same problem in the United States, but let me give you another example. You never thought of this. There's also public housing that still exists, not just Section 8, but actual federal government builds or managed. Here in Texas, for instance, there are some public housing units. And for political reasons, bureaucratic reasons, a lot of these are kept empty, and they stay empty. I haven't quite figured out the logic behind this, or maybe there's maintenance worries. But there also seems to be this idea that the federal government, wants to also do away with available public housing units. And so they're not kept up. The maintenance isn't kept up. They're not expanding them. A lot of them are from the 70s. I don't know about where y'all live. I guess you live in New England states, right? Am I right? I don't know how old New Jersey.
There.
Yeah, over there somewhere. I don't know how old the public housing is. When it was built, if they actually are building them, they're renovating them, or they just keep them empty, it's too difficult to apply for it. That's also an issue, like I think vacancy of there are available units, but it's so bureaucratic. I guess they don't want people to get in there. There's a long waiting list. I know in New York, I was reading a thread that East River, there are some that people wait for 10 years or something, just to be able to get into a co-op. You have to wait 10 years. I mean, so there's a high demand for it, but I guess the political, powers are not, wanting to provide public housing like they do in other countries. Think of Vienna, Austria. They have a very good public housing investment. Berlin, it's not perfect by any means, but they do have a public housing sector, right? So it's something alternative. Maybe it's just not fits with the American image of the state kind of coming into the housing, right?
Well, so one of the Biden proposals
Yeah.
was to convert Section 8 housing from a voucher program to an entitlement. And I think that would be a big shift, because then what would happen is that, so under a voucher program, the government says, I'm going to allocate X amount of money, whatever the bureaucrats say is the right amount. And then we're going to, dole out based on, I think, a lottery system, however much money we can give out, which usually, I think, only 20% of the income eligible individuals actually get the voucher. And then if they get the voucher, they still have to, look for private rental facilities. And if you transform it into an entitlement program like Social Security or food stamps, then the government would have to spend more money to basically give every income eligible person the Section 8 coverage. I think so. That would be, I mean, that's a proposal, right?
Yeah.
But the question of is he going to get it passed?
Larry, do they do that in Austria? Wohngeld? Do they have? It's like a payment. Germany, they call it Wohngeld. It's housing money, and it's like an additional lump of money where you qualify if you're below the poverty line. And it's a percentage, and it's supposed to be the basis to the housing, minimal housing payment. They call it.
I'm sure that must exist too, but I think
because they have Kindergeld. Kindergeld is for the children, right? They give the money for the children because they have low fertility rates. But then they also have in Germany and Austria, I think, Wohngeld, which is housing subsidy money. But it's actually, like you said, it's not a voucher. It's actual money distributed in their account.
Yeah. So I'm sure it exists too, but I think
called something else maybe.
Yeah. So in Vienna, I think they organize housing policy to be mainly on the supply side, rather than on the demand side, which is to say that basically it's about creating living facilities, houses, apartments, and then renting them out for cheap, right? So it will cost you like 300 to 400 euros, right? Where it might be costing you over 1,000 euros if you did the private rental market, right? And then people who are on welfare, it's called Notstand, and you would be getting, let's say, 800 to 900 euros. So you would be devoting about half of it to rent, and probably half of it to food, and that's about it, right? So.
Yeah, and those public housing is administered by the municipality, right? The municipality actually runs it. The Vienna government municipality runs it, organizes it, and okay, so they're like city employees, I guess. Sort of like we have city parks here, city recreation. Think of it like in the U.S. You got local, city parks, recreation. That's part of the local government. Well, I think they attach it to municipality function. It's just like a city employees that
Yeah,
So that,
that's
yeah,
absolutely. So
yeah,
I think the way to deal with housing crisis, the way to deal with job crisis,
yeah.
it would be like we'd have to find a direct solution for it, right? I mean, like I would say I would agree with Dennis' sentiment that I think we shouldn't be changing the education levers too much,
Mhm.
um, because we've already yanked it up to the max,
Mhm.
basically. Um, I personally look. I mean, for a person who really loves learning and higher education, I think I mean, it's going to sound very elitist here, so I don't want to sound too much of that horn here, but I think we should leave the higher education to the nerds. But the only way how you can do that is by transforming the other sectors like housing and jobs. Um, you know,
Definitely.
so that would be much better route, I think. But yeah, higher education as a lever by itself, I think is not gonna
Yeah.
it's not gonna give us too many benefits. I think we basically overinflated the balloon. Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
But then you see, that's also the thing that like I'm not an administrator in a college. Like I don't, look at Excel sheets and balance the books and whatever. Because if I did, I would say, I would have to play the game essentially, right?
Yeah.
It's like I would have to go, send my lobbyists to Washington and make sure that that the bonanza continues, right?
Mm.
Uh, because my organization has to survive. I mean, but that's always the thing where it's like you can only think about sort of like your own organization's survival. But it's like how do you design an overarching policy framework where whether you're Jeff Bezos or whether you're Jeff the beggar, right? Could sort of live in the same society and you know have each other respectfully treated, right?
Mm.
Uh, yeah,
So you remain optimistic as far as the trend in higher education, or you think we're all going to become panhandlers soon? Or you think you remain optimistic? Let's remain optimistic. You think it's, or are we gonna? I said panhandlers. Do you? I am actually thinking about this external constraints, things from the outside that impact academic institutions. And I'm worried about, uh, these constant like austerity, this rhetoric about what's the value of it, this politicization of it. And, I often, because I live in a red state, so I often hear this echoes of you know it's this old uh, unproductive. We're unproductive. They're always claim that we're unproductive and we have to show our worth or worth something. I'm curious about if y'all think it's a worrisome trend and it's having an effect on our own social psychology, you might say, and career decisions that we make. And um, I don't know. I'm just throwing it out there. Maybe I'm pessimistic, but I get this impression there's all these external factors that are eating up higher education opportunities, and it's just looking like just like a horrible outcome scenario. We all wish the best, right? We all wish the best. Uh,
I would probably
mm,
say that I'm optimistic, but I'm not optimistic for our trend line.
okay.
So I don't think that we're going to see substantially more of the population be enrolled inside of universities, nor do I think that that is necessarily the most desirable outcome.
Mhm.
But with regards towards the university as such, whether or not academia is going to fall apart, I don't think that that's
Yeah.
tenable. If anything, the thing that you guys might be in a little bit of a tug of war about is the desire to make university or higher education a public good necessarily invites government regulation and oversight. So if you want the university to be the new high school, then you need to understand that you will inevitably surrender a large amount of the autonomy and extracurricular freedom associated with it. And in areas where education, higher education is free, it's not usually free to choose. Limited number of majors, different systems to get inside of it, a strict meritocratic or connection-based way to achieve higher education results. As in, it's treated very much differently from in the United States, where you go in and do whatever you want. So I'm optimistic, but I'm optimistic in a way that's different. I think that we will eventually just even out into a way that we're supposed to be. Once people
Well,
no longer are.
so in
Yeah.
Vienna, I mean, in Austria, I mean, we do have free higher education, and people have the free choice of majors, and they can study whatever they want. They would have certain caps on certain majors that where you could say demand supply is fixed. Like so that medicine would be the main example, right?
Yeah, I
So
think they call it numerous clauses, right? They
no, no, no,
limit. They limit. Is that
no,
what they
no, no,
call it?
no, numerous clauses. I think is about the minimum GPA that you need to
Oh, okay.
in high school to get
I
in.
got it wrong. That's what they do in
But
Germany.
yeah, that's the numerous
Yeah.
clauses in Germany, I think. But so you have a free choice of majors, except for ones that are directly tied to the supply in the job market, which in this case would be medicine. Um,
Was
and
there also a minimum GPA requirement as well?
In some areas.
in Germany there is, but I think in Austria, as long as you don't fail a class, so you could get in with D's actually with a D average. So,
Hmm.
so the concern that they have in Austria. So I'm not saying everything is great there, right? Um, so what sucks about going there is that is the lack of funding, right? So the fact that because you make it free or you make it very low cost, so it's free for the first 5 years, and then if it takes you longer, then you have to pay. But even then, it's very low cost. And so what sucks is that the class sizes would be huge, right?
Yeah, I
So
remember
you're not going
that.
to have nice interactions with your TA or your professor, and the professor is probably also busy, whatever, writing grants and shit like that. Um, so you're not going to have the sort of nice mentoring relationships that is very common in American universities. And that, how is it reflected in the outcome? Well, it's reflected in the fact that you there's only a very small number of people that will become academics. I mean, even smaller than it is in American universities, right? Um, I used to go to Oxford for 1 year, and
Hmm.
the way how they explained it to me, going into the DPhil program, which is their form of PhD, is you know you go in with the same skills that you go out with the same skills that you went in for, right? Which means that you already have to be an incredible researcher, in order to you know succeed in your PhD, and then when you're done with it, it's just a continuation of it. While I think in America the grad programs are much better geared to provide research training to the students.
Yeah, I think the DPhils are mostly for people who already have master's degrees.
Right.
So instead of the US, everyone gets a mandatory master's degree, which is essentially PhD training before the PhD.
Exactly. Yeah, but so to that point, so if we do an Austrianization of American higher education,
I like that.
um,
Problems, right?
so everything comes with plus and minus would be the main point, right? So
Everything's free, but 100 students in every classroom.
Well, to reverse it, though, the problem I see in the social sciences is the problem of people applying anymore. You know, They have zero-digit enrollment in some areas, and they just then start cutting. I mean, think about how problematic that is in the U.S. You don't have people wanting to even apply. There's just that may reduce the enrollment, reduces the legitimation that the professors need to hold. They got to make a minimum count for people in the class. I think all institutions do that now, right? I mean, don't you have to have a minimum 10 or something before 5? Yeah. So I think the problem I've seen now more and more, at least from my colleagues that I listen to, that they have issues. The social sciences are taking a big hit, and it's particularly hitting hard anthropology, humanities, and sociology. And so it's a reverse. I think it's even criminology, surprisingly, like criminology programs are kind of hit hard. I had a few colleagues in other states, and they were like, they don't have any students. They can't make their programs full, or they don't have enough.
Too many lawyers. So
Well, it's
there's a decrease there.
No, I understand the whole outcome of what's going to happen when they get their degrees, but I'm talking about the actual process of enrolling them. It's all this cost factor, and the pool of applicants decreases, and then they have to do more recruiting just to try to get some more applicants. And whereas in Austria, in Germany, they don't have that side of the problem. They can get enough. Even medical students, they can fail them when they in the middle somewhere. I think that's used to happen in Germany. In Germany, anybody can study medical school, anybody can go to law school, but they will just
fail
fail.
rate's high, yeah.
Yeah, they just fail you right in the third semester. You could sit in a law school seminar, no problem. They'll enroll you, but you can't get past that first test. You really have to know your stuff, and I think that was the concern. That for many years in Germany, people argued that they were very discriminatory towards international students, that there could be any kind of problem with language that people get failed, or some conflict with a professor, you can get failed. It's definitely more bureaucratic. That's what I recall too. Like I don't know if Larry. I don't know if you witnessed that too in Austria, but for me, I noticed that German system is more bureaucratic, and they have more students that come in, but then there's this ability. I mean, because they can select students out of those that they let in. In the U.S., I think the problem is they have to worry about getting people in, and then they have to keep those people in somehow, so they, have classes to make. All right. Can you imagine if you have like a PhD program or something, or a master's program, and you have a cohort, I don't know, of 10 or something, how do you distribute the classes? I don't know how big the cohort is in Ivy League schools, but I guess it's around 25, 30.
Well,
right?
so every quarter is about 10s.
Okay.
So we might have 50, 60 active students.
Yeah, that's about right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Curious if it goes down with pandemic. So a lot of people quit, right? No?
Well, the pandemic screwed on our end, so we don't take new students for this.
Frozen. Yeah.
And then, well, so the argument was, so this is what the professors say, which is who make the decision, is that next year is going to be normal again, right? So you're going to go to 0, and the next year it's going to be normal. But I mean that's an optimistic projection, right? Because it assumes that the funding environment for the university will be restored to the pre-pandemic level. And at the beginning, I mean, so at the moment, I think nobody in the right mind would be able to make an accurate prediction as to when a full-scale return to normal is feasible. Maybe that Pfizer drug, which they said is 90% effective, is going to save us. I don't know.
Yeah.
Basic idea, though, for someone who's currently going through the process of looking into PhD programs, many programs have frozen. So Brown is not accepting anyone. UPenn isn't accepting anyone. Columbia isn't. many schools aren't accepting anyone.
Oh, wow.
And then there are those that are accepting fewer. So Georgetown is accepting fewer students. Northwestern is accepting fewer students. And there's an inverse relationship between job prospects and graduate school enrollment. So more people will be applying to grad schools because it's a pandemic, because if you don't have a job, why not just take classes online?
Okay.
So you're going to have increased competition for fewer spots. So
We need basic
I have
income.
been warned.
Basic income.
I have been warned by so many people that it will be incredibly difficult for me to do what I want to do this time around. So yeah, that'll be
And you
fun.
want to go into economics,
Political
Dennis?
science.
Poli-sci. Okay.
Yeah.
Poli-sci.
So my master's degree was in international economics and strategic studies.
Oh wow.
My undergrad was in international studies.
Oh wow.
And I mean, I have another master's degree, which is a Master of Law in Political Science. So just going to try to go for a PhD. Large part because I've got ambition.
You got ambition. That's right.
I've got to try.
All
not
three of
exactly
us,
the thing that most people associate with ambition. Yeah, I'm so ambitious. I'm going to be an academic.
All three of us are going to write a book. I know it. Let's start planning.
Sure, I'll write an article
panhandlers
too while we're all in PhD programs. Might as well coordinate.
Yeah, might as well. Yeah.
Well, I mean, any project that advocates for more social policy, I think will be. I will always be very open to that.
Okay, I'll keep that in mind.
I would also be like a historical analysis of capitalism, the capitalist world system, like a Wallersteinian.
Oh yeah, he's
kind of approach. Randy Collins, of course, and Wolfgang Streeck. Those are my intellectual heroes.
Yeah.
But
that kind of writing though is pretty complex. You have to do a lot of you have secondary literature. You have to mountains of
Yeah, you have to reconstruct it.
I'm making it more complicated than it is, but when I read Immanuel Wallerstein, listen to his podcast, it's intensive knowledge of world history. It's just economics, poli-sci, sociology, all thrown together in a bucket. It's just massive, You need just impressive scholar. Of course, he's a dependency theorist, Don't even get me started with modernization theorist, the world system. But like it's a massive field, global. Of course, ASA has a section for it, global.
Yeah, global sociology. Yeah, I very much like that approach because, to say, well, this is my discipline and I can only be part of that. Mm-hmm. And then if you talk in that way, so I had one of my papers was rejected in the sociology journal because of.
Oh wow!
Because my paper was citing too many economists. So I cited both. I cited sociology and I cited economics. But that's a ridiculous.
You need an interdisciplinary journal.
Yeah.
I'm surprised there actually isn't one that specializes in the intersection of economics and sociology. I actually thought that there would have been one or two of those.
Yeah.
Well, so anything that has economic sociology in it would be probably favorable, like SASI, Socioeconomic Society. They have a journal, Socioeconomic Review.
That one I'm actually familiar with. It's like welfare state stuff, right?
Yeah, but then they also published some stuff by Streeck. There's
French
Catherine
guy.
Phelan. There's a few of these like French regulation school.
Yeah.
People. So they're very favorable to that because they're based in Europe, right?
Yeah.
The journal. And I always thought the Europeans are, much more open-minded, maybe because. Well, because of the influence of Germany and France. And the Germans and the French, they are always like, sort of like big picture,
Yeah.
I mean, like you can't be more big picture than like Marx and Weber, right? I mean, there's a
Brand theory,
biggest picture.
macro. Yeah, very
Exactly,
macro.
right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, and then
I guess.
yeah,
Go ahead. I was
yeah. So
thinking in
in
our.
America, the emphasis is more on like empirical micro sociology, like
Yeah, Randall Collins, like
critical studies. Yeah.
symbolic. Yeah.
Well, Randy is a very unique guy because he knows both. He speaks both languages, right?
Yeah.
Micro, macro.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, he can't be mapped either functionalist or conflict. He's like excuse me, what I see him doing, he brings in symbolic interactionism within a conflict analysis. He like puts it together. That's how I see him. He kind of, he does.
right. So he merges the Goffman, which is the
Yeah,
most micro, with Durkheim, which is fairly macro. I mean, the interaction
yeah.
ritual chains, which is adopted from interaction rituals.
And microviolence. What was
Um,
that one? Violence. That was kind of a.
yeah.
Dennis is looking at us now, like, what are y'all talking
No,
about?
well, so the violence is like a mixture again between micro and macro, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Because the micro is sort of like the interactions between the police military forces and the civilian population, and then you can have the macro level, structural forces that you know would push people to become violent or not, right?
okay.
So and then also if you look at the origin of sort of Randy's thinking, so his first professor as undergrad in the 60s was a guy named Talcott Parsons,
Oh
right?
yeah, I know
And
Parsons.
Parsons was the founder of the sociology department of Harvard, right? So that was a big thing. And Parsons studied under Marianne Weber and Max Weber's older brother.
Oh,
So Marianne was the widow, right? So it was shortly after Max Weber died. It was 1920s. And Talcott Parsons did a translation of Weber into English. And he sort of was the founder of structural functionalism, right? Which is
boy.
this idea that you know everything in society uh, serves a
Purpose.
purpose, right?
Yeah, I know
Um,
functionalism. Yeah,
right. So that's a functionalism. So it's
and
very
Merton
conceptual.
too. Merton,
Well, Merton was a little bit more
neo
like
functionalist.
yeah, he went a little bit beyond that because of the um,
Strain theory and all that.
yeah, it's like a medium range theory called
Yeah,
this
yeah, yeah.
range theory.
I'm with you. I'm with you.
Um,
Now, what about Luhmann? You read Luhmann before?
I haven't read Luhmann before, so
Okay,
I can't really
that's
comment. But but
Dennis.
uh, but Collins basically said, his raison d'être as a scholar is uh, his intellectual opposition to structural functionalism, right? Is basically to take conflict theory, started by Marx and Weber, but taking it in a sort of like non-Marxian direction, right? And a non-Marxian direction usually means Weberian. That's why he wrote the books in the 80s about summarizing Weber's theory, about the state and about cities. I mean everything that Weber wrote about. Um, and his first major book in the 70s was called Conflict Sociology.
I love that one. I use
Yeah.
passages from it. Yeah, I like the way he takes the social psychology aspect very serious in conflict analysis, and the role of individual actors and emotional domination. He has all these unique ways of characterizing, putting in micro with the macro. Like usually
Yeah.
just conflict thinkers were just sort of always thinking about structure. Yeah, very good. Yeah, I.
Well, so the reason why he was so obsessed with emotions
Uh-huh.
is because before he did his PhD at Berkeley sociology, he was in a Stanford master's degree in psychology,
Okay.
and he was doing experiments on rats in the lab.
Oh wow.
But he was so bored by it. But I mean, of course, he took psychological concepts and he applied it to sociology, and that's why he's such a fresh thinker, right? Because just use another discipline to sort of influence your own discipline, and it's always
Yeah, unique intellectual, definitely. I'm trying to think of. Yeah, we're having a good discussion. Good discussion here. I had some things wrote out. I don't know if I even addressed it. Did y'all have a lot of
Is it,
scrap paper that you
so is
wrote
it
out?
Dennis? Are you running out of time?
Yeah, you
Because
ran out of time.
I know you had some.
I've got a couple minutes left, but I should probably leave by 4:30.
Okay, good. We're good. Well, I guess I fell down. I thought I had it. I
Once
wanted
upon a
to.
time, you did say that you had two questions you wanted to ask me after discussing the structure of the economy. You said the informal housing market, and then there was something else, and I don't think it
Informal
ever happened.
labor. How do you
Informal labor.
account for, uh, assuming that it's based on equilibrium, supply demand, the impact of informal labor, for instance, informal labor economy, and what impact that has on the formal economy or in that space, wherever that locality is? I'm very interested in that because it's like, day laborers in United U.S. cities are a function of the economy. They do receive income. They produce labor, for I don't know, whatever companies, but they're not as counted, I guess, the same way. They're not
They
viewed
definitely are.
as maybe a benefit to the economy or whatever they're viewed as. But they do bring in money. They do spend money. I know there's transfer of money here in a local area. There's a lot of day laborers, and it's creating actually a financial kind of. There's people that have to send their money from here to Mexico, and there's like financial centers that grow. There's obviously food industries, restaurants that cater to many of the informal laborers. A lot of them are construction workers. A lot of them are just doing informal work, and they make up a proportion of the local economy here. But I'm curious if that's ever calculated in some ways in
Uh,
traditional economics.
well, yeah, traditional
Yeah.
economics definitely tries to work around informal labor markets, in large part because developing economies are so contingent upon the informal labor market, and you get people, famous economists like Hernando de Soto, whose entire enterprise is built around trying to understand how things become highly informal and how to formalize an informal market so that you can bring about more inclusive development. The classical argument for a economist that might be centrist or center right has to deal with the fact that regulation or localized power structures have built an exclusionary framework whereby legal participation in the local economy is very hard. This is particularly true through urbanized areas where you have large slums, not necessarily because they can't move into formalized housing, but because getting a permit or acquiring a license or joining the formalized labor market has so many institutional barriers that it could take 4 to 5 years simply to get the right to buy a home. And at that point, why not just set up a little shanty and then be with a whole bunch of other people in the exact same situation?
Mhm.
And because once you reach a certain critical mass of total numbers of people, governments are not inclined to get rid of people who live in slums. If anything, they want them there, contained and okay. The moment the bulldozers come, there are typically riots and burnings and a whole bunch of protests and potentially people trying to overthrow the government. So they are reluctant to approach the problem too much, but there's also no incentive for them to change because they are the people who were able to get into it legally, and they've created a structure that supports them. Peru and several countries are trying to deal with the informal labor market, trying to formalize it, trying to make things easier, but
Can you name me some of those? I'm curious if you have it on top of your head. Any of
uh,
those that you think I should read? Those that are
Hernando de
trying to.
Soto is probably the one that you should read first, and
What do you
I'll
know the
think about
title
some others afterwards.
of his books or what's I don't know
So there's The Mystery of Capital and The Other Path.
the mystery of capital sounds interesting.
Yeah, The
Thanks, Dennis.
Mystery of Capital is his newer book, which has an entire chapter focused on the formalization of the American economy when it was predominantly informal.
Okay.
because the American tradition isn't just a tradition of the idea of manifest destiny spreading civilization out west, the old idea that you might find in some 1960s, 70s, and 80s textbooks.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of the framework that some people have, particularly in Hernando de Soto school, is that formalization of the economy on the coastlines and in urban environments pushed people progressively towards the hinterlands. And as they ended up developing their own economic structures, they built up a formalized economy because they obtained power over it. Because if you're going into a less governed space and you're building a government there, you are essentially creating the incentive structures for the economy. And this is before a lot of regulation and federal taxation structures. So you could build your own economies and then make those formal. So you have a progressive shift of people moving further and further out west.
Mm-hmm.
And a very easy way to look at this is how people dealt with the whiskey rebellion early on in the Republic. Because a lot of people used barter economy, and your primary vehicle of currency were consumables, one of which was whiskey.
Mm-hmm.
So that's part
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Got to write a dissertation on that. That would be very the modern.
So
barter
so that would be in the Mystery of Capital, the discussion
Okay.
of the
I wrote it
broader
down.
problem of informal labor.
I wrote it down. Thanks.
Yep,
Appreciate
and the other path is specifically about Peru, because Hernando de Soto is a Peruvian economist.
Okay.
And it goes about trying to create an economic alternative towards terrorism.
The other economy.
The other path.
The other path. Okay.
Because a very prominent terrorist group at the time, a Maoist-inspired one, was Sendero Luminoso under a guy named Gonzalo. And it was a Maoist-style revolutionary group. And Hernando de Soto said, don't go into Maoist terrorists. Here's another opportunity to try to formalize the informal economy and make it so that ordinary people aren't going to go out and join a terrorist group. And for that, his facilities were actually bombed. So Sendero Luminoso took him credibly enough as a threat. And you actually have a lot of influence on modern Peruvian governments. So like Pedro Pablo Kuczynski, the former president or prime minister of Peru, was heavily influenced by Hernando de Soto. So anyways.
Similar to Chicago School of Economics, are they?
Yeah. So.
Okay.
So not quite Chicago School, because the U.S. doesn't really have Chicago School anymore. So we've married everything together now. It's all some mix.
I got it.
Of Keynesian and neoclassical. So we have this post-neoclassical synthesis in the economic framework, because really the divisions between modern economists are very slight, actually. Unless you are more from a Marxist lens, it's not that different, and Marxist or libertarian. So, for instance, if you're a neo-Hayekian or someone who's a follower of Rothbard, then you also have interesting beliefs about the political economy. Right? So in the United States, you see a transition towards the informal economy primarily when you see depressed economic outcomes. So in a way to put this is that if you go to J.D. Vance country, if you go to the Left Behind country, you'll see a rise in informal markets. People doing business for each other without any formalized record keeping of the economic transaction, because taxation ends up becoming overall intrusive. And you also see a heavy informalization sector around border zones. So if you're able to have people hop the border during the day and go back home overnight, or they'd stay for a couple of months and then go back home, very easy. So I'm not sure about construction, but I know agriculture, it's a perennial problem in agriculture and in even housekeeping, home services.
Domestic,
Yeah, so
the government doesn't get any tax revenue, but they still extract the labor, through the agricultural production, right?
Well, yeah, the overall economy receives a net positive expenditure that is not registered with the IRS. So part of the reason why a lot of people are big about formalizing informal sectors of the economy is because you get to tax them. And this is a very big reason why a lot of people said, let's legalize marijuana, because then you could tax marijuana. So, yeah.
But if you formalize the day laborers, you have to pay a minimum wage then, right?
Yeah, you would.
I know.
And if you paid the minimum wage, that would be a problem.
Yeah.
To some people.
Interesting.
So, yeah, I'm about to head out, but is
That was awesome, Dennis.
hopefully an answer.
Yeah, thank you so much. That really helps. Hey, we're going to do this again? Are we almost?
Dennis, Mike, yeah, thank you
Yeah.
very much for joining,
Hope
and
so.
we'll definitely do it again. I mean, the opportunity arises for sure. I mean, there's a lot of things happening in the world, and even if not a lot of things are happening in the world, it's definitely happening in our minds, and that's very fertile. So, so we'll certainly come up with a topic to talk about. Right?
Okay. Bye-bye.
Sounds good.
Okay. All the best.
Bye.
Good. Thank you very much.